The autumn evening had settled over Greystone Hall with the particular stillness that precedes revelation, though none of the distinguished guests gathered in Lady Pemberton's drawing room could have anticipated the extraordinary scene that was about to unfold before them. The occasion was ostensibly a civilized affair, a small dinner party to celebrate the engagement of Mrs. Vivian Ashworth to the Honourable Charles Whitfield, followed by an intimate gathering to discuss Lady Pemberton's latest charitable endeavour. The drawing room, with its Wedgwood blue walls and carefully arranged chrysanthemums, provided the perfect backdrop for the sort of refined society that moved through London's better circles with practiced elegance. The assembled company represented a cross-section of respectability and wealth. Lady Pemberton herself, their hostess, possessed that particular combination of steel and silk that marked the truly formidable society matron. Her nephew, Captain Geoffrey Pemberton, recently returned from India, carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command, though there was something restless in his manner that suggested civilian life had not entirely suited him. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, the family physician and a noted specialist in nervous disorders, sat with his fingertips pressed together in his characteristic pose, observing the company with the detached interest of one who had made a career of studying human nature. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth, the lady of the hour, was perhaps 35 years of age, possessed of that refined beauty that comes not from youth, but from careful cultivation of one's best features. Her dark hair was arranged in the latest fashion, and her sapphire engagement ring caught the lamplight as she gestured gracefully during conversation. Her fiancé, Charles Whitfield, was a solid, dependable sort, a barrister of good family and better prospects, the kind of man mothers recommended and daughters eventually learned to appreciate. The conversation had turned, as it often did in Dr. Thornfield's presence, to matters of the mind. The human memory, he was saying, settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man approaching his favorite subject, is far more fragile and malleable than we care to admit. I've seen cases where patients have constructed entirely false histories for themselves, complete with detailed recollections of events that never occurred. How fascinating, murmured Miss Dorothy Fairfax, Lady Pemberton's companion, a sharp-eyed spinster who missed very little. But surely one would remember something as significant as, say, a marriage? Dr. Thornfield smiled indulgently. My dear Miss Fairfax, you would be surprised. The mind protects itself in the most ingenious ways. Traumatic events, uncomfortable truths, these can be buried so deeply that the conscious mind genuinely believes they never occurred. It was at this moment that Mrs. Ashworth, who had been listening with apparent interest, suddenly grew very pale. Her hand, reaching for her teacup, began to tremble almost imperceptibly. Vivian, my dear, said Charles Whitfield, leaning forward with concern. Are you quite well? Mrs. Ashworth looked up at him with an expression of the most profound confusion. I beg your pardon, she said slowly, her voice taking on an odd, distant quality. But I'm afraid I don't understand why you're addressing me so familiarly. We haven't been introduced, have we? A small, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Charles laughed uncertainly. My darling, what a peculiar jest. Of course we've been introduced. We're to be married next month. Married? Mrs. Ashworth's voice rose slightly, and she looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. But that's impossible. I'm already married. I've been married for 7 years now. To David Ashworth. We were married in Italy, in a little church overlooking the sea. She touched her throat with a gesture of growing agitation. Where is my wedding ring? I always wear my wedding ring. The silence that followed was profound. Lady Pemberton's teacup clinked against its saucer as she set it down with excessive care. Captain Pemberton straightened in his chair, his military bearing asserting itself in the face of an unexpected situation. Dr. Thornfield leaned forward with the intense interest of a scientist observing a rare phenomenon. Vivian, Charles said very quietly, David Ashworth was your first husband. He died in a climbing accident in Switzerland 7 years ago. You've been a widow since then. We've discussed this many times." "No." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried absolute conviction. "No, that's not right. David isn't dead. He can't be dead. I would know if he were dead. I would feel it." She looked around the room with growing desperation. "Why are you all looking at me like that? Why won't anyone tell me where David is?" It was Dr. Thornfield who broke the increasingly tense silence. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said gently, rising from his chair, "I think perhaps you should rest. You've had a shock of some kind, these episodes of confusion." "I'm not confused." Mrs. Ashworth stood abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "I know who I am, and I know who my husband is. David Ashworth is alive, and I'm going to find him." She moved toward the door with swift, determined steps, but as she reached for the handle, she suddenly stopped. Her hand fell to her side, and she turned back to face the room with an expression of dawning horror. "The accident," she whispered. "I remember now. The telegram, the funeral. Oh God, what's happening to me?" Before anyone could respond, she had fled from the room. The sound of her footsteps could be heard crossing the marble hall, followed by the slam of a door somewhere in the depth of the house. The remaining guests sat in stunned silence for several long moments. Finally, Charles Whitfield rose unsteadily to his feet. "I should go to her," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Thornfield carefully, "it would be better to allow her some time to collect herself. These psychological episodes can be quite overwhelming." It was Captain Pemberton who voiced what they were all thinking. 7 years, he said grimly. She's been perfectly rational for 7 years, and now, 3 weeks before her wedding, she suddenly believes her first husband is still alive. 20 minutes later, the scream that echoed through Greystone Hall was unmistakably one of genuine terror. It came from the direction of the conservatory, where Mrs. Ashworth had apparently sought solitude among the exotic plants and flowers that were Lady Pemberton's particular pride. They found her standing over the body of Mr. James Hartwell, Lady Pemberton's solicitor, who had arrived late to join the party and had apparently been waiting in the conservatory for the dinner to conclude. He lay crumpled beside the ornamental fountain, his head at an unnatural angle, a heavy crystal paperweight nearby stained with blood. Mrs. Ashworth stood motionless, her evening gown splattered with crimson, her eyes wide with shock. In her hand, she clutched a small, leather-bound diary. When Captain Pemberton gently took it from her nerveless fingers, he found it filled with entries in a man's handwriting, entries dated within the past month and signed D.A. "David Ashworth," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's been alive all this time, and James Hartwell knew. He's been hiding the truth from me for 7 years." As the police were summoned and the household thrown into chaos, one detail emerged that would prove crucial to the investigation that was to follow. Mr. Hartwell had been heard arguing with someone in the conservatory just before his death, arguing about a trust fund, a forged death certificate, and a conspiracy that had kept a woman from her rightful husband for 7 long years. The lady who forgot she was married had remembered at last, and someone had died to keep her from the truth. The arrival of Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard at 11:30 brought with it the methodical efficiency that had made him one of the Yard's most reliable men, though his weathered face showed the strain of being summoned from his bed to deal with what promised to be a particularly delicate case. The inspector, a sturdy man of middle years with the patient demeanor of one who had learned that the truth rarely revealed itself quickly in matters involving the upper classes, established himself in Lady Pemberton's morning room with the quiet authority of long experience. The conservatory had been sealed, the body photographed, and the initial evidence catalogued. But Japp knew from years of working alongside a certain Belgian detective that the most important clues often lay not in the physical evidence, but in the tangled web of human relationships that surrounded every crime. The crystal paperweight, stained with blood, told only part of the story. The rest would have to be extracted from the assembled company with patience and considerable skill. Mrs. Ashworth remained under Dr. Thornfield's care, sedated and confined to her room under the watchful eye of Miss Fairfax. Before succumbing to the doctor's ministrations, she had managed to provide a fragmentary account of her discovery, how she had fled to the conservatory seeking solitude, found the diary hidden beneath a loose flagstone near the fountain, and while absorbed in its shocking contents, had looked up to find Mr. Hartwell's lifeless form nearby. Her insistence that the diary proved her husband's survival had only added to the evening's air of unreality. The diary itself presented a puzzle that grew more perplexing with each entry. Written in what appeared to be David Ashworth's distinctive hand, it chronicled his supposed survival of the climbing accident and his subsequent discovery that his death had been fabricated by persons unknown. The entries spoke of watching his wife from afar, of being unable to approach her directly due to some unnamed threat, and of his growing determination to expose the conspiracy that had stolen 7 years of their life together. Inspector Japp studied the final entry with particular interest. J.H. has agreed to meet with me at last. He claims he can explain everything, but I fear his motives are not pure. V must know the truth, whatever the cost. If something happens to me, she must look for the proof in the place where we first spoke of forever. The remaining guests had been assembled in the drawing room, where the cheerful Wedgwood blue walls and carefully arranged chrysanthemums now seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. Each person present was acutely aware that they were part of a closed circle, trapped within Greystone Hall until the police could make sense of the tragedy that had shattered Lady Pemberton's carefully ordered world. Charles Whitfield sat rigidly on the settee, his barrister's composure having entirely deserted him. The solid, dependable man who had seemed so perfectly suited to guide Mrs. Ashworth into a secure second marriage now appeared genuinely shattered by the evening's revelations. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to process the implications of his bride-to-be's apparent mental collapse and her discovery beside a murdered man. She seemed perfectly rational until tonight, he insisted when questioned by Inspector Japp. We had discussed David's death many times. She spoke of him with appropriate sadness, but seemed to have accepted her loss and moved forward. This sudden insistence that he's alive, it's as if she's become an entirely different person. Yet there were details that troubled the inspector. In Hartwell's coat pocket, they had found a train ticket to Dover dated for the following morning, along with a hastily scrawled note that read, "The game is up. V knows too much. Must leave tonight before..." The sentence ended there, cut short by death among the exotic plants. Lady Pemberton maintained her composure with the iron discipline of her class, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the strain she was under. She answered the inspector's questions with clipped precision, her gaze occasionally sweeping over her assembled guests as if assessing their reactions more carefully than the official inquiries. "Mr. Hartwell has been our family solicitor for nearly 15 years, she explained. He handled all the legal arrangements following David Ashworth's death, the insurance settlements, the trust funds, the various documents required when a man dies abroad under such tragic circumstances. I cannot imagine why anyone would wish him harm. Captain Geoffrey Pemberton proved more forthcoming, though his revelations only deepened the mystery. My aunt asked me to be present tonight, specifically because she had concerns about Vivian's state of mind," he admitted, ignoring Lady Pemberton's sharp intake of breath. There had been incidents, small things but disturbing. She had been asking questions about David Ashworth's death, wanting to see documents, requesting details about the accident that she had never sought before. Dr. Thornfield's professional perspective added yet another layer of complexity to the evening's events. As both a medical man and a long-standing friend of the family, he had been observing Mrs. Ashworth's behavior with growing concern for several weeks. There are documented cases of what we might call selective memory recovery, he explained to Inspector Japp. The mind can suppress traumatic memories for years, only to have them resurface under stress. Mrs. Ashworth's approaching marriage may have triggered some psychological mechanism that caused her to reject the reality of her first husband's death. Miss Fairfax, when questioned, provided the sharp observations of one accustomed to noticing details others might miss. Mrs. Ashworth has been receiving letters, she revealed quietly. Letters that she would quickly hide when anyone approached. I assumed they were from Mr. Whitfield, but now I wonder if perhaps someone had been corresponding with her, feeding her these fantasies about her husband's survival. It was at precisely 20 minutes past midnight that Lady Pemberton made an announcement that surprised even Inspector Japp. "I've taken the liberty," she said with quiet dignity, "of sending for Mr. Hercule Poirot. Given the delicate nature of this matter and the need for absolute discretion, I felt it best to engage someone of his particular talents." The reaction in the room was immediate and varied. Dr. Thornfield raised an eyebrow with professional interest, while Captain Pemberton straightened with the alert attention of a military man recognizing a superior strategist. Charles Whitfield looked confused, and Miss Fairfax allowed herself the faintest smile of anticipation. Inspector Japp, who had worked with the famous Belgian detective on numerous occasions, felt a mixture of relief and resignation. "Poirot's in London, then?" he asked. "He has consented to come immediately," Lady Pemberton replied. "I believe the matter requires his particular expertise." The little Belgian detective arrived at precisely midnight, stepping from a taxi with the careful precision that marked all his movements. He paused on the threshold of Greystone Hall to adjust his coat and ensure that his appearance met his exacting standards before allowing Ellison, the butler, to escort him to the drawing room. Hercule Poirot entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had solved more puzzles than most people could imagine. His dark suit was immaculate despite the late hour, his silk tie perfectly knotted, and his famous mustaches waxed to geometric perfection. His bright, intelligent eyes swept the assembled company with the keen interest of a connoisseur examining a particularly complex work of art. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said with a small, precise bow, "I come at once, as you see. Lady Pemberton does me the honor of requesting my assistance in what appears to be a most intriguing problem." He moved to the fireplace and, without appearing to think about it, made a small adjustment to one of the ornamental dogs on the mantel, aligning it perfectly with its companion. Only then did he turn his full attention to the company. "Inspector Japp," he said warmly, extending his hand to his old colleague. "Once again we find ourselves confronted with the complexities of human nature. But first, if you please, the presentations." The introductions were made with formal courtesy. Captain Pemberton, the military nephew; Dr. Thornfield, specialist in disorders of the mind; Miss Dorothy Fairfax, the observant companion; Mr. Charles Whitfield, the bewildered fiancé. Each person studied Poirot with varying degrees of curiosity, apprehension, and hope. "Et Madame Ashworth?" Poirot inquired gently. "Resting under sedation," Dr. Thornfield replied promptly. "I felt it best, given her disturbed state." "Bon. The mind, when it is shaken, is like water in a glass. Disturb it further, and the waves rise anew." Poirot's gaze moved thoughtfully around the room. "But tell me, Inspector Japp, you have examined the scene of this tragedy?" "Thoroughly, Poirot. The conservatory's been sealed, evidence catalogued. Mrs. Ashworth was found standing over the body with this diary in her hand." Japp produced the leather-bound book. "Claims it proves her first husband is still alive." Poirot accepted the diary with the reverence one might show a sacred text, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "David Ashworth," he murmured, reading the initials embossed on the front. "The husband who died 7 years ago in Switzerland. Or perhaps, as this suggests, the husband who did not die at all." He opened the diary and read several entries in silence, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "Most curious," he said finally. "The handwriting appears genuine. The paper shows appropriate aging. Yet the content suggests a conspiracy of remarkable complexity." You think it's authentic? Charles Whitfield asked desperately. I think, Monsieur Whitfield, that authenticity is a more complex matter than we might wish. But we shall discover the truth, step by step, using the little grey cells. Poirot closed the diary carefully. For now, however, I would see the place where Monsieur Hartwell met his end. The conservatory, even in the harsh glare of police lanterns, retained an otherworldly beauty. Tall palms cast intricate shadows on the tiled floor, and the fountain continued its gentle murmur, indifferent to the violence that had occurred nearby. Poirot stood just inside the entrance, his keen eyes taking in every detail before approaching the chalk outline that marked where James Hartwell had fallen. He was struck from the front, Poirot observed, studying the position of the body and the blood spatter. The crystal paperweight, heavy, readily available, suggesting a crime of sudden passion rather than careful planning. Yet, he pointed to a small pile of ash near the fountain. Someone has been smoking here recently. Lady Pemberton, you permit smoking in this room? Certainly not, came the crisp reply. I despise the habit. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then examined the loose flagstone where Mrs. Ashworth claimed to have found the diary. Most convenient, this hiding place, almost as if it were meant to be discovered at precisely the right moment. As they returned to the drawing room, Poirot made his requirements clear. We shall proceed methodically, he announced. In the morning, I will speak with each of you individually, and most importantly, with Madame Ashworth when she is recovered. Until then, no one leaves Greystone Hall. No letters are to be written, no telephone calls made. We begin, as they say, with a clean slate. Is such confinement really necessary? Dr. Thornfield asked with a slight frown. It is essential, mon ami. In a case where memory itself may be the weapon, we must ensure that no further influences are brought to bear. Poirot's eyes glittered with the anticipation of a master craftsman approaching a particularly challenging puzzle. For I suspect that before this matter is resolved, we shall discover that the line between truth and deception, between memory and fantasy, is far more blurred than any of us imagine. As the company dispersed to their rooms, Poirot lingered by the mantel, studying the calling cards arranged on a silver tray. One card in particular caught his attention, Mr. James Hartwell's, dated the previous day. He was expected, Poirot murmured to Inspector Japp. Yet, tonight he came uninvited. Why, I wonder, did a man who had helped arrange a death 7 years ago suddenly feel compelled to flee the country? And what truth was so dangerous that it cost him his life? The great detective straightened his waistcoat and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Tomorrow, mon ami, we shall begin to unravel this most fascinating web of deception. For I have the feeling that the lady who forgot she was married has remembered far more than anyone realizes. And someone is very afraid of what she might remember next. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Greystone Hall revealed a household transformed by tragedy and suspicion. Hercule Poirot descended to the breakfast room at precisely 8 o'clock, his appearance immaculate despite having retired only 4 hours earlier. He found Inspector Japp consuming eggs and bacon with the methodical efficiency of a professional who had learned to take sustenance when opportunity presented itself. Poirot settled himself at the table with characteristic precision, adjusting his napkin and ensuring that his coffee cup sat exactly parallel to the edge of his plate. He surveyed 2 boiled eggs with judicial calm and turned one by a precise quarter until both shells aligned in their stands like twin sentries. You have begun early, mon ami, Poirot observed, measuring sugar into his coffee. 3 cubes, each placed delicately in the center, one upon the other. Pathologist puts time of death somewhere between 10 and 11, Japp reported, consulting his notebook. House was full of people, and yet no one heard the fatal blow. The conservatory door to the terrace was unlatched. Someone could have come and gone without much notice. Ah, but it is not the sound one listens for, Inspector, but the silence that follows it. Poirot sipped his coffee thoughtfully. And what of Monsieur Hartwell's recent activities? Interesting developments there. According to his clerk, Hartwell had been increasingly agitated over the past week, asking questions about old files relating to deaths abroad. Booked his Dover passage only yesterday afternoon. Paid cash. Not his usual way. His housekeeper says he'd been receiving letters that upset him greatly. Letters he would immediately burn after reading. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Letters, you say? And his financial arrangements? Substantial withdrawal 3 days ago. £500 in cash. £500, Poirot repeated slowly. A sum that suggests either payment or preparation for flight, or perhaps both. Come, Inspector, let us begin with the method. Order, you understand, is essential when dealing with the disorder of crime. They began with the conservatory, where Poirot moved through the space with feline grace, his keen eyes missing nothing. He knelt by the chalk outline where Hartwell had fallen, then examined the loose flagstone where the diary had been discovered. Most convenient, this hiding place, he murmured, noting fresh grit on the stone's edge. Recently lifted, recently replaced. And here, he pointed to a small pile of ash near the fountain. Someone has been smoking here recently, despite Lady Pemberton's prohibition. He crossed to examine the ash more closely, his fingers delicately separating the grey flakes. Not cigarettes, Inspector. A pipe, a cheap mixture, harsh, with traces of cherry flavouring. And here, a fern frond broken but not crushed, suggesting someone taller than Madame Ashworth moved quickly through this space. The interviews began with Lady Pemberton in her private study. She received Poirot with the dignified composure of one prepared to face an inquisition with grace, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the strain she was under. Monsieur Poirot, I trust you understand the gravity of this situation, not only a murder, but the scandal surrounding poor Vivienne. Naturally, madame. My discretion is legendary, almost as legendary as my methods, Poirot replied. You did not invite Monsieur Hartwell here last evening. I did not. He was expected for dinner, but arrived late without explanation. He often handled estate matters for me, investments, legal arrangements. Nothing that should have led to this tragedy. Ah, but everything is of consequence, madame. You mentioned concerns about Madame Ashworth's state of mind. Lady Pemberton hesitated fractionally. She had been asking rather pointed questions about David Ashworth's death. Questions that had long been settled, so it was most unsettling. Miss Dorothy Fairfax proved more forthcoming when questioned. The sharp-eyed companion possessed the practical calm of a woman long acquainted with crises not her own. Mrs. Ashworth has been receiving letters, she revealed without preamble. Pale blue envelopes, foreign stamps with deliberately blurred postmarks. She would hide them beneath the blotter in the writing room. Last Thursday I found the blotter disturbed, but no letter. That same afternoon Mr. Hartwell called. Most observant, mademoiselle. And last evening, the conservatory smelled of tobacco earlier. Not Captain Pemberton's Turkish cigarettes, which leave a sweet odor. This was bitter, like English tobacco or a poorly cleaned pipe. Also, Mr. Whitfield had ink on his cuff and seemed preoccupied. He spoke privately with Mr. Hartwell before dinner, and they parted looking anything but friendly. Captain Geoffrey Pemberton presented himself with military bearing, though Poirot detected an undercurrent of nervous energy. You wish to see me, sir? Only to establish your movements between 10 and 11 o'clock. Billiard room with Dr. Thornfield mostly. Broke my cue. Ellison can confirm I requested another. Stepped onto the terrace for a smoke around 10:30. The terrace adjoining the conservatory. The same? Geoffrey admitted. I glanced in. Saw no one at the time. Poirot examined the Captain's Turkish cigarette case with interest. Not the ash we discovered by the fountain. Tell me, Captain, your aunt summoned you last evening because she anticipated difficulties. Geoffrey's jaw tightened. I've had financial entanglements. Hartwell managed certain family matters, and I needed his cooperation. He liked keeping people beholden to him. I disliked the man intensely. but that's as far as it goes. Dr. Marcus Thornfield removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully as he spoke. Mrs. Ashworth is experiencing what we might term a dissociative episode, a return of suppressed memories triggered by extreme emotional stress. The diary acted as a catalyst. You have knowledge of handwriting analysis, Doctor? I am not a graphologist, but I knew David Ashworth personally. He consulted me before his marriage regarding nervous exhaustion. The handwriting in that diary resembles his, though such things can be skillfully forged. You were present when news of his death arrived. I was. I verified the details with Hartwell and corresponded with a Swiss colleague. The death certificate appeared entirely regular. His tone flattened. If it was falsified, it was done with considerable expertise. Poirot noted the defensive undertone. You and Captain Pemberton were together at billiards until when? 11:15. I went to fetch a tonic for Lady Pemberton's headache and did not return. So you passed the conservatory landing. I did. I observed nothing unusual. The doctor's composure remained steady. I smoke a pipe occasionally, but not last evening. Charles Whitfield appeared drawn and bewildered, the shock having settled into profound confusion. Monsieur Poirot, I cannot comprehend Vivienne's involvement in such a thing. This diary, it's madness. You love Madame Ashworth deeply? Yes, completely. Enough to endure the resurrection of a husband she adored. The smallest pause. If David lives, she must be free to choose. Noble sentiments, monsieur. You spoke with Hartwell last evening. I asked him to cease his interference. He had been hinting at legal complications if Vivienne married while questions remained about her first husband's estate. I told him I would seek independent counsel. Poirot indicated the ink stain on Whitfield's cuff. You were writing something? A letter to my chambers postponing a hearing. I did not send it, given the circumstances. The most crucial interview was reserved for Mrs. Ashworth herself. Dr. Thornfield had pronounced her sufficiently recovered to speak, though he warned that her mental state remained fragile. They found her in Lady Pemberton's morning room, clutching the leather-bound diary with desperate intensity. You are the detective Lady Pemberton summoned, she said, her gaze fixing on Poirot with haunting desperation. You must help me understand what has been done to me. Madame, I am here to discover the truth, whatever that truth may be. Tell me, in your own words, what you remember of your husband's death 7 years ago. Mrs. Ashworth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We were in Switzerland on our delayed honeymoon. David was passionate about climbing. It drew me to him, that spirit of adventure. He went out early that morning to attempt a difficult route on the Matterhorn. I begged him to wait, to take a guide, but he laughed and said he wanted to surprise me with his success. Her breathing became labored. The rescue party found his equipment scattered on the rocks below. His body was never recovered. The crevasses were too deep, too dangerous. I waited 3 days, hoping, praying, but finally had to accept he was gone. And the legal arrangements? Poirot inquired gently. Mr. Hartwell handled everything so efficiently. He said deaths abroad required special procedures. Swiss authorities, British consular officials. It took months to resolve. He advised me to return to London while he managed the formalities. Said it would be too distressing for me to deal with directly. So you never spoke with the Swiss authorities yourself? Never saw the official reports? Mr. Hartwell said it would be too painful. He showed me copies of relevant documents, but handled all direct communications. Her eyes blazed with sudden fury. Don't you see? He could have fabricated everything. This diary proves David has been alive all these years. She opened the diary to a page near the middle. Look at this entry from last month. Today I saw V in Hyde Park, walking with the man she believes she will marry. She looked happy, and it broke my heart to remain hidden. But J.H. assures me that revealing myself now would only bring danger to us both. Mrs. Ashworth looked up with desperate conviction. Only David would know about that afternoon in Hyde Park. What I was wearing, the exact route I took. This isn't forgery. This is my husband's hand, his voice, his love speaking across 7 years of enforced separation. And yet, Madame, if your husband has been alive, why not approach you directly? What danger could justify such elaborate deception? I don't know, but this diary suggests he was close to discovering the truth, that he had finally convinced Mr. Hartwell to help expose the conspiracy, and now Mr. Hartwell is dead. She clutched the diary tighter. What if they've killed David too? What if I'm too late? Poirot studied her face with intense concentration. Madame, have you ever felt watched in recent years? Small incidents suggesting unusual interest in your activities. Mrs. Ashworth started visibly. Yes, times when I felt eyes upon me, when I would turn expecting to see someone familiar, but finding only strangers. Charles said it was natural for a widow to feel vulnerable. But after our engagement announcement, it became more pronounced. I even thought I saw... She stopped abruptly. What did you think you saw? A man who looked like David. Just glimpses. A figure disappearing around a corner. Someone with his walk, his way of holding his shoulders. I told myself it was grief playing tricks, but now I wonder if it was really him, trying to find a way to approach me safely. The loose flagstone in the conservatory. How did you know to look there? I didn't know. I was simply drawn to it. When I knelt by the fountain to compose myself, I noticed one stone seemed different. When I pressed upon it, it shifted, revealing something hidden beneath. Drawn to it as if by instinct, or by half-remembered knowledge. Mrs. Ashworth grew thoughtful. There was something familiar about that spot. David and I had visited here once before, shortly after our marriage. He was fascinated by the fountain, said it reminded him of a place in Italy where he had proposed to his first love. He never spoke of her in detail, but he said seeing the fountain made him more determined to keep all his promises to me. Poirot's expression grew grave. One final question. The diary entry speaking of the place where we first spoke of forever. Does this phrase have particular meaning? Mrs. Ashworth went very pale. It was a private joke between us. On our wedding day, when we were alone as husband and wife, he asked where I wanted to spend eternity. I said, wherever you are, and he said we had just spoken of forever in the most perfect place on earth. Our marriage bed. She looked up with anguished eyes. No one else could know that phrase. That diary is real, Mr. Poirot. My husband is alive. As Poirot prepared to leave, he paused thoughtfully. Madame Ashworth, we will discover the truth, but I fear it may be more complex and painful than you imagine. Until then, you must remain here under Dr. Thornfield's care. Later, alone with Inspector Japp in the conservatory, Poirot stood with hands clasped behind his back, regarding the scene with the intensity of a master craftsman examining a particularly challenging puzzle. The circle narrows, mon ami. We have pride, fear, money, and love, all engaged in a complex dance. Each has lied, but not all for the same reason. Who looks worse to you, Poirot? The one who has taken most pains to appear reasonable. But patience, first the false pattern must show itself. Then we shall see the truth that hides behind it. He looked once more at the diary, cradled in his hands like a small creature that might bite. A most artful thing. It tells the story everyone fears, yet it tells too much. I wonder who wrote it. For the mind that did so knew precisely which chord, when struck, would shatter Madame Ashworth's composure. He aligned the diary squarely with the edge of the table, order restored for the moment. Tomorrow, Inspector, we shall delve deeper into the psychology of this fascinating case. For I suspect that the lady who forgot she was married has remembered far more than anyone realizes, and someone is very afraid of what she might remember next. The little gray cells were already working, connecting threads that others might dismiss as coincidence. The convenient diary, the fleeing solicitor, the mysterious letters, the intimate knowledge of private moments. Truth, Poirot knew, was rarely simple and often far more uncomfortable than the lies people chose to believe. The discovery came, as such discoveries often do in the methodical world of police investigation, through the patient examination of seemingly insignificant details. Inspector Japp emerged from the conservatory at 9:30, his weathered face bearing the satisfaction of a man who believed he had found the key that would unlock the entire mystery. In his hand, he carried a small evidence bag containing what appeared to be the remnants of pipe tobacco, dark, aromatic, and unmistakably scented with cherry. Hercule Poirot, who had been observing the morning's activities from the drawing room while meticulously straightening a series of photographs that had been disturbed during the previous evening's commotion, looked up with interest as Japp approached. The little Belgian detective possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect when his colleague had convinced himself of a solution, and the inspector's confident stride suggested just such a moment had arrived. "Found this tucked beneath a loose floorboard near the fountain," Japp announced, holding up the bag. "Same cherry scent as the ash we discovered yesterday evening. Someone was smoking in that conservatory, Poirot, and they tried to hide the evidence." The systematic questioning that followed revealed a pattern that seemed to point with uncomfortable clarity toward one member of the household. Charles Whitfield, when confronted with the evidence, admitted to owning a pipe and to occasionally smoking a cherry-flavored mixture. His explanation, that he found the sweet aroma less offensive to others when he worked late in chambers, sounded reasonable enough, but his obvious discomfort under questioning suggested deeper currents of anxiety. "I did step onto the terrace for air," Whitfield acknowledged, his barrister's composure beginning to crack under the steady pressure of official inquiry. "The evening had become rather overwhelming, but I did not smoke, and I certainly did not enter the conservatory." Miss Dorothy Fairfax, whose sharp eyes missed very little, provided additional details that seemed to tighten the net around the unfortunate solicitor. "I observed Mr. Whitfield near the East Corridor around 10:30, she reported with the precision of a trained observer. "He appeared to be lighting something. I caught the distinctive smell of sulfur from a struck match." The case against Whitfield grew stronger with each piece of evidence that emerged. Ellison, the butler, confirmed seeing the gentleman near the conservatory entrance at approximately the time of the murder. The gardener's boy, who had been tending to some late-season plantings, reported hearing raised voices from the direction of the glass house. One voice demanding silence, another protesting innocence. Most damning of all was the discovery in Whitfield's coat pocket of a hastily written note that read, "The arrangement cannot continue. V must know the truth, whatever the consequences. The deception has gone on long enough." The handwriting was unmistakably his own, the ink still fresh enough to suggest it had been written the previous evening. Inspector Japp laid out his theory with the methodical precision that had made him one of Scotland Yard's most reliable men. "It's clear enough, Poirot. Whitfield discovered something about David Ashworth's death, perhaps through his own legal inquiries into Mrs. Ashworth's affairs. He confronted Hartwell, demanding an end to whatever conspiracy had been maintained for 7 years. Hartwell refused, threatened exposure of Whitfield's own involvement, and in the heat of the moment, Whitfield struck him down." "And the diary?" Poirot inquired gently, his tone betraying nothing of his own thoughts. "Planted to throw suspicion elsewhere. Whitfield knew Mrs. Ashworth's mental state was fragile. He placed the diary where she would find it, knowing it would send her into the kind of confused state that would make her appear guilty. A clever bit of misdirection, if you ask me." The assembled household received this explanation with varying degrees of relief and dismay. Lady Pemberton maintained her composure with aristocratic discipline, though the slight tightening around her eyes suggested the strain of having her carefully ordered world subjected to such scrutiny. Captain Pemberton nodded with military approval at what seemed to be a logical conclusion to an unfortunate affair. Dr. Thornfield, however, raised a professional objection. "Inspector, while Mr. Whitfield's behavior was certainly suspicious, I must point out that the psychological profile doesn't quite fit. A man trained in law, accustomed to careful reasoning and measured responses, would hardly commit such a rash act and then leave such obvious evidence of his involvement." Poirot, who had been listening to these proceedings with the patient attention of a connoisseur studying a particularly complex vintage, finally spoke. The good doctor raises an interesting point, but there is something else that troubles the little grey cells, Inspector Japp. He rose from his chair and moved to the mantelpiece, where he made a small adjustment to a porcelain figurine that had been placed slightly off-center. Only when perfect symmetry was restored did he continue. Consider, if you please, the sequence of events as we have reconstructed them. Monsieur Whitfield, a man of legal training and careful habits, decides to confront Monsieur Hartwell about a conspiracy that has persisted for 7 years. He chooses to do this at a social gathering, in a house full of witnesses, at a time when discovery is virtually inevitable. Does this seem the action of a rational man? People don't always act rationally when they're under stress, Japp countered, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Precisely my point, mon ami. But then, having committed this impulsive act, our supposedly irrational Monsieur Whitfield demonstrates remarkable cunning in planting the diary to implicate Madame Ashworth. He transforms from a man driven by passion to a calculating manipulator in the space of minutes. It is possible, certainly, but it strikes me as convenient. Poirot moved to the window overlooking the conservatory, his keen eyes studying the scene of the crime with renewed interest. There is also the matter of the tobacco itself. Monsieur Whitfield admits to smoking cherry mixture, yes, but only occasionally, and only when working late. Yet the ash we discovered suggests someone who smokes regularly. The quantity was too substantial for a single, nervous cigarette. He turned back to face the room, his expression growing more thoughtful. And then there is the diary itself. If Monsieur Whitfield planted it to implicate Madame Ashworth, he chose a most curious method. The diary speaks not of her guilt, but of her husband's innocence. It suggests a conspiracy, yes, but one in which she is the victim, not the perpetrator. Why would a guilty man choose evidence that ultimately exonerates the person he wishes to frame? Miss Fairfax, who had been following Poirot's reasoning with evident interest, added her own observation. There's also the matter of timing, Mr. Poirot. I saw Mr. Whitfield in the East Corridor, but that was before I heard the voices from the conservatory. If he had already committed the murder, why would he linger in the area where he might be observed? The confidence that had marked Inspector Japp's earlier presentation began to waver under the weight of these observations. So, you think Whitfield is innocent? I think, Inspector, that Monsieur Whitfield is a man with secrets, certainly. His note suggests knowledge of some deception, and his behavior indicates considerable anxiety. But the murder of Monsieur Hartwell? No, I do not believe he is our killer. Poirot returned to his chair and settled himself with characteristic precision. What we have here is a most skillful false lead. Evidence that appears conclusive, but which, upon closer examination, reveals itself to be too perfectly arranged. Someone has taken considerable care to ensure that suspicion falls upon Monsieur Whitfield, using his own legitimate concerns about the Ashworth affair to create a plausible motive. But who would go to such elaborate lengths? Lady Pemberton asked, her voice betraying the first crack in her composure. Someone who understands the psychology of investigation, madame. Someone who knows that the first plausible suspect to emerge often becomes the focus of official attention, allowing the true culprit to escape scrutiny. Poirot's eyes glittered with the cold fire of intellectual challenge. We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication, one that has been planning this moment for some time. At that moment, the morning's second post arrived, bringing with it a development that would transform the entire complexion of the case. Ellison entered bearing a telegram on a silver tray, his usually impassive features showing signs of disturbance. For Inspector Japp, sir. Marked urgent. Japp tore open the yellow envelope and read its contents with growing amazement. Good Lord, Poirot. This is from the Swiss authorities. They claim to have David Ashworth in custody, picked up trying to board a train to Paris using forged identity papers. The silence that followed this announcement was profound. Mrs. Ashworth, who had been resting under Dr. Thornfield's care, chose that moment to appear in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes blazing with desperate hope. "David," she whispered. "They've found David." Poirot accepted the telegram from Japp's nerveless fingers and subjected it to the same intense scrutiny he had given the diary. His examination was thorough and methodical, checking paper quality, typeface consistency, and official seals with the concentration of a scholar deciphering ancient texts. "Most interesting," he murmured after several minutes. "The routing codes are correct. The official stamps appear authentic, but..." He paused, consulting his pocket watch with apparent irrelevance. "Inspector, when precisely was this telegram dispatched?" "According to the header, yesterday evening at 11:15. 11:15, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Approximately 1 hour after Monsieur Hartwell's murder. How remarkably convenient that Monsieur Ashworth should choose that precise moment to emerge from 7 years of hiding and attempt to flee the country. The implications of this timing were not lost on anyone present." Mrs. Ashworth sank into the nearest chair, her face cycling through hope, confusion, and dawning horror. "You think the telegram is false?" she asked, in a voice barely above a whisper. "I think, madame, that someone has gone to considerable trouble to create the impression that your husband is alive and in custody, precisely when such news would seem to resolve all questions about Monsieur Hartwell's murder." Poirot's voice was gentle but implacable. "The paper stock is correct for Swiss official communications, but the typewriter ribbon shows no wear patterns consistent with heavy governmental use. The signature purports to be that of Inspector Muller, but the letter formation suggests someone unfamiliar with German script." Dr. Thornfield leaned forward with professional interest. "You're suggesting this entire development is fabricated?" "I'm suggesting that we are witnessing the second act of a very carefully orchestrated drama. The first act established Monsieur Whitfield as a plausible suspect. The second act provides an alternative explanation that appears to exonerate everyone present while actually deepening the mystery." Poirot rose and began pacing the confines of the drawing room with controlled energy. "Someone wants us to believe that David Ashworth is alive, that he has been in hiding for 7 years, and that his emergence now is connected to Monsieur Hartwell's death." "But why?" Lady Pemberton demanded. "What possible purpose could such an elaborate deception serve?" "To control the narrative, madame. To ensure that when the truth finally emerges, it serves the purposes of the person who has been manipulating events from the beginning." Poirot stopped his pacing and fixed the assembled company with his penetrating gaze. "We are not dealing with a simple crime of passion, but with a conspiracy that has been years in the making. Someone has been waiting for precisely the right moment to eliminate Monsieur Hartwell and to use Madame Ashworth's emotional fragility as a weapon against her." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Mrs. Ashworth buried her face in her hands, while Charles Whitfield looked around with the bewildered expression of a man who suddenly realized he had been a pawn in a much larger game. "So what do we do now?" Inspector Japp asked, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Poirot straightened his waistcoat and smiled with quiet determination. "Now, mon ami, we begin the real investigation. We have been presented with 2 false leads, one pointing to Monsieur Whitfield, another suggesting the resurrection of David Ashworth. Both are skillfully crafted, both contain enough truth to be believable, but both serve to obscure rather than illuminate." He moved once more to the mantelpiece, this time to straighten a small clock that had been running several minutes slow. "The person responsible for these deceptions is still among us, watching our reactions, adjusting their strategy as needed. They have demonstrated remarkable patience and considerable psychological insight, but they have also revealed something crucial about themselves." "What's that?" Miss Fairfax asked with keen interest. "They have an obsessive need for control, for order, for ensuring that every detail serves their ultimate purpose. And that, mademoiselle, will ultimately prove to be their downfall." Poirot's eyes glittered with anticipation. For in their very perfection, they have created imperfection. In their desire to control every variable, they have revealed the hand behind the manipulation. The little Belgian detective surveyed the assembled company with the satisfaction of a master craftsman who had finally identified the flaw in an otherwise perfect mechanism. Tomorrow, we shall begin to unravel this most fascinating web of deception. But tonight, I suggest everyone remain exactly where they are, for I have the distinct feeling that our manipulator is not yet finished with their performance, and the final act may prove to be the most dangerous of all. As the household dispersed to contemplate these disturbing revelations, Poirot remained behind, studying the forged telegram with the intensity of a man reading his opponent's strategy. The lady who forgot she was married was being drawn into an increasingly complex trap, but Hercule Poirot had not built his reputation by allowing innocent people to fall victim to elaborate schemes. The game, as they say, had only just begun. The third morning at Greystone Hall dawned with the particular stillness that precedes a storm, and Hercule Poirot descended to breakfast with the measured precision of a master craftsman preparing to test his most delicate instruments. He found Inspector Japp already at the table. The morning's correspondence spread before him like pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle, his weathered face showing the strain of a case that had twisted far beyond the boundaries of conventional investigation. Poirot settled himself with characteristic care, adjusting his napkin until it lay at the perfect angle, and regarded his 2 soft-boiled eggs with the same judicial attention he might give to crucial evidence. Only when both eggs sat in precise alignment in their silver stands did he turn his attention to his colleague. "You have the look, mon ami, of a man who has spent the night wrestling with contradictions," Poirot observed, measuring sugar into his coffee with mathematical precision. 3 cubes, each placed delicately atop the other. Another telegram arrived in the early hours, Japp reported, his voice carrying the frustration of a professional who sensed manipulation but could not yet identify its source. This time claiming that David Ashworth has escaped Swiss custody during transport, vanished completely, along with his police escort. Poirot accepted this information with the calm of a chess master observing his opponent's increasingly desperate moves. Most convenient, this escape, and most revealing. Our adversary grows impatient, Inspector. The carefully constructed narrative begins to require more and more elaborate support. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully, his keen eyes already calculating the psychological implications of this latest development. Someone is working very hard to maintain the illusion that David Ashworth lives. But why, I wonder, do they require such elaborate proof of his existence? What purpose does it serve? The answer, Poirot suspected, lay not in the fabricated evidence itself, but in its effect upon the minds of those who encountered it. Someone was using Mrs. Ashworth's psychological vulnerability as both weapon and shield, creating a maze of false memories and manufactured hope that served to obscure the truth rather than illuminate it. Today, Inspector, we begin the delicate work of applying pressure to this carefully constructed facade, but we shall not use the sledgehammer of direct accusation. No, we shall use something far more effective. The gentle but persistent force of psychological discomfort. Poirot's strategy was elegantly simple in conception, but masterfully complex in execution. He understood that a mind capable of such intricate deception would possess an almost pathological need for control, for order, for the satisfaction of seeing each element of their plan fall into perfect alignment. Such a mind would be deeply disturbed by chaos, by any element that resisted incorporation into their grand design. The first phase of his psychological game began at luncheon, which Poirot arranged to be served in the smaller morning room rather than the formal dining hall. He personally supervised the seating arrangement, ensuring that each suspect had a clear view of the others and, crucially, of himself. Miss Fairfax he placed directly opposite, knowing that her sharp eyes would catch the subtle reactions he wished to observe. As the household gathered, Poirot made a show of adjusting small details, straightening a picture frame by a barely perceptible degree, shifting a silver candlestick until it achieved perfect symmetry with its partner, realigning the salt cellars with geometric precision. To most observers, these appeared to be the harmless eccentricities of a fastidious man. But Poirot was watching for something else entirely. The involuntary response of someone whose own need for order made such adjustments irresistible. The human mind, Poirot began as the first course was served, his voice carrying the conversational tone of a man discussing the weather, is a most fascinating landscape. It constructs its own realities, its own truths, often with such conviction that even the architect comes to believe in their creation. He paused to take a delicate sip of soup, allowing his words to settle in the minds of his audience. But what interests me more, mes amis, is the mind that constructs realities for others. Such a mind must possess not only intelligence, but an almost artistic appreciation for the psychology of deception. Dr. Thornfield cleared his throat with professional interest. You speak of deliberate manipulation, Monsieur Poirot. I speak of artistry, Doctor. Consider the diary we discovered. It is not merely a forgery, but a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It speaks to Madame Ashworth's deepest hopes and fears, echoes her most private thoughts, resurrects her most cherished memories. Only someone with intimate knowledge of her relationship with David Ashworth could have crafted such a convincing fabrication. Mrs. Ashworth, who had been listening with growing agitation, set down her spoon with trembling fingers. You're certain it's a forgery? I am certain, madame, that it tells someone exactly what they wished you to believe. Poirot's voice was gentle but implacable. The phrase about the place where we first spoke of forever, this was known only to you and your late husband, n'est-ce pas? Yes, it was our private joke about... She stopped, color flooding her cheeks. About your wedding bed, oui. A most intimate detail, one that appears in this diary with perfect accuracy. This suggests either that your husband lives and wrote these words, or that someone possessed knowledge so detailed, so personal, that they could reconstruct your most private moments with disturbing precision. The effect of this observation rippled around the table like stones dropped in still water. Lady Pemberton's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her wine glass. Captain Pemberton shifted in his chair, his military bearing unable to entirely conceal his discomfort. Charles Whitfield looked genuinely bewildered, while Dr. Thornfield maintained his professional composure, though his eyes had sharpened with interest. As the meal progressed, Poirot began the second phase of his strategy, the systematic introduction of small disorders into the perfect world someone had constructed. He commented casually on the arrangement of flowers on the sideboard, suggesting they were perhaps not quite balanced, and made a minute adjustment to their positioning. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that one of the paintings in the corridor seemed to hang slightly askew. To most of the company, these appeared to be the idle observations of a man with an obsessive attention to detail. But Poirot was watching for something specific, the involuntary response of someone who found such imperfections genuinely disturbing, someone whose own psychological makeup demanded that every element be in its proper place. The response came, as he had anticipated, in the form of small, seemingly unconscious corrections. As they moved from the dining room to the drawing room for coffee, Lady Pemberton paused almost imperceptibly to straighten the painting Poirot had mentioned. The gesture was so natural, so automatic, that she herself seemed unaware of it. But Miss Fairfax caught Poirot's eye with the slightest nod of confirmation. The afternoon brought the third phase of Poirot's psychological campaign, the systematic application of pressure through carefully targeted conversations. With each suspect, he engaged in discussions that probed the edges of their knowledge and comfort, watching for the telltale signs of a mind under strain. With Charles Whitfield, he spoke at length about the legal implications of forged documents, the ease with which death certificates could be falsified, and the complex web of financial arrangements that surrounded a man's death abroad. He watched the barrister's face carefully, noting genuine confusion rather than the guilty knowledge he might have expected. Lady Pemberton received his attention in the form of a detailed discussion about estate management, the intricacies of trust funds, and the considerable sums involved in David Ashworth's inheritance. Her responses were measured and appropriate, but Poirot detected an underlying tension when the conversation turned to the role of solicitors in managing such affairs. Dr. Thornfield proved the most interesting subject for psychological pressure. Poirot engaged him in a philosophical discussion about the nature of memory, the ease with which false recollections could be implanted in a vulnerable mind, and the psychological profile of someone capable of such manipulation. The perpetrator of such a scheme, Poirot mused, would need to possess not only intelligence but a deep understanding of human psychology. They would need to know their victim intimately, their fears, their hopes, their most vulnerable emotional points. Such knowledge typically comes from a position of trust, does it not, Doctor? Thornfield's response was professionally composed, but Poirot noted the slight tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible pause before he answered. Indeed, Monsieur Poirot, the violation of such trust would be particularly heinous. Precisely. And yet, such a person would also need to possess the technical skills necessary to forge documents, to manipulate communications, to create the elaborate infrastructure of deception we have witnessed. This suggests someone with both intimate personal knowledge and professional expertise, a rather unusual combination. As evening approached, the cumulative effect of Poirot's psychological pressure began to manifest itself in subtle but unmistakable ways. The household's atmosphere had grown increasingly tense, with each suspect showing signs of strain that had not been present that morning. Conversations became more guarded, glances more suspicious, and the careful social veneer that had initially masked everyone's true feelings began to show cracks. Mrs. Ashworth, in particular, seemed to be experiencing a profound internal struggle. "Mr. Poirot," she said during a quiet moment in the conservatory, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding my instinctive reaction to the diary. You're right, I felt fear rather than joy. But why would I fear the return of a husband I loved? Perhaps, madam, because some part of your mind recognizes that the husband described in that diary is not the man you married. The David Ashworth you loved would never have remained hidden while you suffered, would never have watched you from shadows while you rebuilt your life. Your fear may be your soul's recognition that someone is using your love as a weapon against you." The psychological game reached its crescendo as the household gathered for dinner. Poirot had arranged for several small but significant changes to the usual routine. Place settings slightly altered, familiar objects moved by imperceptible degrees, the normal order of service subtly disrupted. To most observers, these changes would have been barely noticeable. But for someone whose psychological stability depended upon maintaining perfect control over their environment, such disruptions would have been profoundly unsettling. The effect was precisely what Poirot had anticipated. One member of the company showed increasing signs of agitation as the evening progressed. Small corrections made to objects that had been deliberately displaced, an almost compulsive need to restore order wherever it had been disturbed, and a growing tension that no amount of social polish could entirely conceal. As the evening drew to a close, Poirot found Inspector Japp looking increasingly puzzled by the day's activities. "I'm not entirely certain what you've accomplished, Poirot. Everyone seems more nervous than before, but we're no closer to identifying our killer." Poirot's smile was that of a master craftsman who had successfully tested his most delicate instruments. "On the contrary, mon ami, we have accomplished a great deal. The guilty party has revealed themselves through their very need to maintain the illusion of control. Like a moth drawn to flame, they cannot resist the temptation to correct, to adjust, to ensure that their perfect world remains undisturbed." He gestured toward the drawing room, where the evening's social gathering was finally dissolving into individual retreats. Someone in that room has spent years constructing an elaborate deception, using Madame Ashworth's grief and vulnerability as the foundation for their scheme. But such a mind cannot tolerate chaos, cannot bear to see their careful arrangements disturbed. And today, through small disruptions and gentle pressure, we have forced them to reveal their true nature. Tomorrow, Inspector, we shall see the results of tonight's psychological pressure, for I suspect that our architect of deception will find the strain of maintaining their facade increasingly difficult to bear. And when they finally make their move to reassert control, we shall be waiting. The lady who forgot she was married was about to discover that her greatest enemy had been hiding not in the shadows of her past, but in the very heart of her present life. And Hercule Poirot, master of the human psyche, had laid the perfect trap to catch them. As the household settled into an uneasy night's rest, the little Belgian detective remained in the drawing room, making final adjustments to his psychological snare. Tomorrow would bring revelations, but tonight belonged to the subtle art of pressure applied with surgical precision to a mind that could no longer bear the weight of its own deceptions. The fourth morning at Greystone Hall arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn air, but the household atmosphere remained thick with the psychological tension that Hercule Poirot had so carefully cultivated. The little Belgian detective descended to breakfast at his customary hour, his appearance immaculate despite the late night, and found Inspector Japp already examining what appeared to be the remnants of burned documents scattered across the morning room table. "Someone's been busy during the night, Poirot," Japp announced grimly. The gardener found these in the ash pit behind the kitchen gardens at first light. From what we can make out, they appear to be drafts of official communications, telegrams by the look of them. Poirot accepted the charred fragments with the reverence of an archaeologist handling precious artifacts, his keen eyes studying the partial text that remained visible. "Most illuminating, Inspector. See here, Bundes, Polizei, and beneath it, Transit, Zurich, Bern. Someone has been manufacturing Swiss authority communications in the comfort of an English country house." The discovery of the burned papers was only the beginning of the morning's revelations. As the household gathered for breakfast, it became immediately apparent that Miss Dorothy Fairfax was absent from her usual place at table. Lady Pemberton's inquiry sent Ellison to investigate, and the butler returned with news that transformed the morning's unease into genuine alarm. "Miss Fairfax has been found unconscious in the small writing room, Your Ladyship," Ellison reported with barely controlled agitation. "Dr. Thornfield is attending to her now." They discovered Miss Fairfax seated in a chair beside the writing desk, a damp compress held to the back of her head, her sharp eyes somewhat unfocused, but her mind clearly functioning. Dr. Thornfield hovered nearby with professional concern, though Poirot noted that the doctor's usual composure seemed slightly strained. "A blow to the head," Thornfield reported efficiently. "Not severe, but enough to render her unconscious for several hours. She has some memory of the attack." Miss Fairfax, despite her obvious discomfort, provided an account with characteristic precision. "I heard sounds from the writing room around 3 o'clock, papers rustling, drawers being opened. When I investigated, I surprised someone at the desk. Tall figure, moving with purpose. They struck me before I could cry out." "And what were they seeking in the writing room?" Poirot inquired gently. "The diary," Lady Pemberton announced grimly from the doorway. "Someone forced my private safe during the night and removed Mrs. Ashworth's diary. The combination was known only to myself and Ellison." Poirot's eyes sharpened with intense interest. "Forced, madame? Or opened by someone who had observed the combination being used?" Lady Pemberton's aristocratic composure wavered slightly. "The lock shows no signs of forcing. Whoever opened it knew the sequence." The writing room itself told a story of methodical destruction and careful concealment. Poirot examined the desk with his characteristic thoroughness, noting the slightly disturbed blotter, the faint, sweet-sour smell of burned paper from the grate, and the minute displacement of objects that suggested someone had worked here in darkness. "Inspector, if you would be so kind as to lift the blotter," Poirot requested with quiet authority. Japp complied, revealing the blue felt beneath. Poirot placed a sheet of thin paper over the surface and, moistening a pencil with his tongue, began to make light, even strokes across the paper. Words appeared like ghosts returning from the dead. "My dear V, I have only a moment. Hartwell has compromised everything. You must be brave. The place where we first spoke of forever. Look there for the truth. All my love, D." The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Mrs. Ashworth, who had been listening from the doorway, swayed visibly at the sight of the message. "David wrote this," she whispered. "But how? When?" "Someone wrote this, Madame," Poirot corrected gently. "Someone who knew your most intimate secrets, who could replicate not only your husband's handwriting, but his voice, his manner of expression, his knowledge of your private moments together." Dr. Thornfield leaned forward with professional interest, though Poirot detected a slight tension in the man's posture. The psychological manipulation required for such deception would be considerable. The perpetrator would need intimate knowledge of both parties, access to samples of the husband's writing, and a deep understanding of the victim's emotional vulnerabilities. "Precisely, Doctor. And such knowledge typically comes from a position of trust. Someone who was present during the original tragedy, who helped manage the aftermath, who had access to personal documents and private communications." It was at this moment that Lady Pemberton made an admission that transformed the entire complexion of the case. "There is something I must tell you, Mr. Poirot, something I perhaps should have mentioned earlier." She led them to her private study, where she opened a concealed safe behind her late husband's portrait. From within, she withdrew a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Letters in David Ashworth's unmistakable handwriting. "I preserved David's correspondence with Vivian at her request," Lady Pemberton explained, her voice strained. "She found them too painful to keep herself after his death, but couldn't bear to destroy them. I offered to maintain them until she was ready to face those memories again." Poirot examined the letters with intense concentration, comparing the handwriting to the message revealed on the blotter. "Perfect source material for forgery," he murmured. "And who knew of these letters' existence?" "The family, naturally. Dr. Thornfield, as he handled many arrangements following David's death. Mr. Hartwell, certainly, and Charles Whitfield when he began courting Vivian. I felt he should understand the depth of her attachment to her first husband." The final revelation came when Poirot discovered a second document in Lady Pemberton's safe, one that provided the missing motive for the entire elaborate deception. It was a legal document dated 7 years prior, establishing a substantial trust fund in Mrs. Ashworth's name, with a crucial stipulation. The funds would revert to the Pemberton estate, should she remarry. "Mon Dieu," Poirot breathed, studying the document with growing understanding. "Here is our motive, Inspector. Someone has been systematically preventing Madame Ashworth's remarriage to protect a substantial financial interest. The diary, the false memories, the psychological manipulation, all designed to keep her trapped in widowhood." Inspector Japp examined the trust document with growing amazement. "The sum involved is considerable, Poirot. Enough to justify elaborate deception, certainly enough to justify murder when that deception was threatened." "Indeed. And now we understand why Monsieur Hartwell had to die. He was the solicitor who established this arrangement, and he had begun to develop a conscience about the deception. His attempt to flee the country suggests he could no longer bear the weight of his complicity." Mrs. Ashworth, who had been listening with growing horror, finally found her voice. "You're saying that someone has kept me from happiness, from love, from a normal life, all for money." "I'm saying, Madame, that someone has used your grief as a weapon against you, your love as a prison, your trust as a tool of manipulation. But we shall discover who, and we shall see that justice is done." As the implications of these discoveries settled over the assembled company, Poirot noted the various reactions with his characteristic attention to detail. The guilty party was among them, he was certain, and the psychological pressure he had applied was beginning to show results. Someone's carefully constructed world was crumbling, and they would soon be forced to take desperate action to protect themselves. The lady who forgot she was married was beginning to remember not just her past, but the systematic way it had been stolen from her. And Hercule Poirot, master of human psychology, was closing in on the architect of this elaborate deception. The game was approaching its climax, but the little Belgian detective knew that cornered criminals were often at their most dangerous. The next phase of his investigation would require all his skill to prevent further tragedy, while ensuring that the truth finally emerged from 7 years of carefully constructed lies. As the household dispersed to contemplate these disturbing revelations, Poirot remained in the study, arranging the evidence with characteristic precision. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, but tonight belonged to preparation and the careful consideration and of a mind twisted enough to use love itself as an instrument of cruelty. The atmosphere in Greystone Hall had grown brittle with tension, each member of the household moving through the day as if conscious that the endgame was approaching. Hercule Poirot, as was his habit, began the morning not with grand pronouncements, but with small, meticulous acts of order. In the quiet sanctum of the writing room, he adjusted the blotter, balanced the letter knives, and set the inkwell square. Itaï was not idle fussing, but a patient invitation for the hidden hand to reveal itself. Physical clues and psychological insights. As Poirot examined the writing desk, he observed faint traces of cherry pipe ash, an anomaly in a household where smoking was discouraged, and a substance previously linked to evidence in the conservatory. More tellingly, he found subtle traces of antiseptic in the ash, a scent noted by Miss Fairfax after her attack. This detail, corroborated by her memory of the blow's angle and direction, suggested a left-handed assailant with access to medical supplies. Further scrutiny of the writing desk and Lady Pemberton's safe uncovered more. Faint impressions on the blotter, and a small torn fragment of letter pressed under a loose flagstone in the conservatory. The fragment bore 2 hands, David Ashworth's original and a second, practiced copyist's notes about death certificates. Poirot also discovered handwriting manuals and ink-matching guides tucked away in the library, and upon inspection of Dr. Thornfield's medical bag, a vial of chloral hydrate, a sedative consistent with Miss Fairfax's sudden incapacitation, the pattern of manipulation. Poirot's little grey cells turned to the most intimate clue of all, the phrase, "the place where we first spoke of forever." Mrs. Ashworth had always insisted that only her late husband could know its significance, yet here it appeared in forged correspondence and the diary. Poirot reasoned that only someone who had been her confidant in the raw aftermath of tragedy, her physician, her counselor, would have gained such privileged access to her deepest memories. This was not mere forgery. It was psychological warfare, years in the making. Motive, means, and opportunity. The motive was clear. The trust fund's reversion clause, discovered in Lady Pemberton's safe, meant that Mrs. Ashworth's remarriage would strip her of a considerable fortune, reverting it to the Pemberton estate, accessible to those managing it. The means were equally clear. Access to David's original letters, medical knowledge to subdue and manipulate, and the psychological expertise to craft forgeries so convincing they could shake a grieving widow's reality. The opportunity was present at every turn. Dr. Thornfield's professional role gave him access to both the physical evidence and Mrs. Ashworth's inner world. Poirot's psychological trap. Having assembled the pattern, Poirot set his final snare, a series of small, deliberate disruptions to the household's order. He adjusted pictures, displaced objects, and subtly altered routines, observing which members of the household could not resist restoring order. He noted, too, the reactions to his inquiries about safe combinations and night telegrams, confirming his suspicions about who had both the need and the compulsion to control every variable. The final arrangement, Poirot concluded, through both physical and psychological deduction, that the architect of the deception was someone who combined access, motive, and an obsessive desire for control. The clues, ash with antiseptic, left-handed force, forged handwriting, intimate knowledge, and a trail of sedative, pointed in one focused direction. But true to his method, Poirot refrained from explicit accusation, instead preparing for the final act. A gathering of suspects, a trigger for the guilty to act in defense of their fragile order, and the denouement that would lay every deception bare. As night fell, Poirot wrote 2 notes, one to Miss Fairfax, inviting her to observe discreetly, and one to the butler, instructing him to leave the conservatory door unlatched. For in a house where order had been weaponized, Poirot knew that the hand which reached to restore it was the hand that had orchestrated tragedy. In the coming hours, the lady who forgot she was married would finally see her past restored, not through the cruel manipulations of a trusted confidant, but through the elegant, relentless logic of Hercule Poirot. The final confrontation was near, and the truth, at last, would have nowhere left to hide. Evening settled over Greystone Hall with the deliberate precision of a master craftsman arranging his final tableau. Hercule Poirot had spent the afternoon personally supervising the arrangement of Lady Pemberton's drawing room, transforming the familiar space into something resembling a courtroom where truth would finally be permitted to emerge from 7 years of carefully constructed shadows. Each chair had been positioned with mathematical exactitude, creating a circle that would allow every participant to observe the reactions of their companions as the web of deception was systematically unraveled. The familiar Wedgwood blue walls and carefully tended chrysanthemums now served as backdrop for what promised to be the penultimate act in a drama of extraordinary psychological complexity. Poirot stood before the mantelpiece, his dark suit immaculate despite the late hour, his famous mustaches waxed to geometric perfection. Behind him, the fire whispered with reassuring warmth, but the atmosphere in the room carried the electric tension that precedes revelation. Inspector Japp had positioned himself strategically near the door, his weathered face showing the alert attention of a professional who sensed that years of patient investigation were about to bear fruit. His notebook lay open in his capable hands, ready to record whatever confessions or accusations might emerge from the evening's proceedings. The assembled company took their designated seats with varying degrees of reluctance and apprehension. Lady Pemberton maintained her aristocratic composure, though the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the strain of having her carefully ordered world subjected to such intense scrutiny. Captain Geoffrey Pemberton sat with military straightness, his eyes moving constantly between Poirot and the other suspects with the tactical awareness of a man accustomed to assessing potential threats in hostile territory. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth occupied the chair nearest to the fire, her face pale but determined, the infamous diary resting in her lap like evidence of her own psychological torment. Charles Whitfield had taken his place beside her, his barrister's training evident in his careful attention to every word that would be spoken, though his earlier ordeal as a suspect had left him visibly shaken. Miss Dorothy Fairfax, despite the bandage still visible beneath her carefully arranged hair, had insisted on being present. Her sharp eyes missed nothing as they swept the assembled company, and Poirot noted with satisfaction that she had positioned herself where she could observe everyone's reactions without being easily observed herself. Dr. Marcus Thornfield entered last, his medical bag in hand, explaining with professional courtesy that he wished to monitor Mrs. Ashworth's condition during what promised to be an emotionally challenging evening. He selected a chair that afforded him a clear view of all present, his composed demeanor intact, despite the subtle signs of strain that Poirot's trained eye detected around his eyes and mouth. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded attention in drawing rooms and courtrooms across Europe. We gather tonight not merely to discuss a murder, but to examine a masterpiece of psychological manipulations that has consumed 7 years in its construction and 4 days in its exposure. He moved to the center of the room with characteristic precision, pausing to make a minute adjustment to a small ornamental dog on the side table, not because it needed straightening, but because he wished to observe who found such imperfections genuinely disturbing. His bright eyes took in each face with penetrating intensity, cataloging reactions, noting the involuntary responses that revealed more than words ever could. What we have witnessed at Greystone Hall is not a simple crime of passion, but something far more insidious, a systematic campaign of psychological warfare waged against a vulnerable woman, using her own love and grief as weapons. The murder of Monsieur James Hartwell, while tragic, represents merely the final, desperate act in a much larger and more cruel design. He gestured toward the evidence arranged with mathematical precision on the mahogany table. The burned telegram fragments, the handwriting samples, the trust fund documentation, and most significantly, a small metal case that had been recovered from its hiding place beneath the conservatory fountain. Each piece of this puzzle tells us something about the mind that created it. We are dealing with someone who possesses not only considerable intelligence, but an almost pathological need for control, for order, for ensuring that every element serves their ultimate purpose. Mrs. Ashworth's grip tightened visibly on the diary, her knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Poirot, you promised us answers. The diary, the telegrams, the message about David. Surely these prove that my husband is alive." "They prove, madame, that someone wished you to believe your husband was alive. But the question we must ask is not whether David Ashworth lives, for I assure you he does not, but rather who possessed the knowledge, the skill, and the motive necessary to construct such an elaborate deception." Poirot moved to the fireplace, where he made another seemingly casual adjustment, this time to a photograph that had been deliberately tilted by a barely perceptible degree. Again, his eyes swept the room, noting which member of the company found such disorder genuinely distressing, whose hands twitched with the involuntary desire to restore perfect alignment. The diary itself is a masterwork of forgery, crafted by someone with intimate knowledge of the relationship between David and Vivian Ashworth. Consider the phrase that appears within its pages, "the place where we first spoke of forever." This was not public knowledge, mes amis. This was a private joke, a sacred memory shared between husband and wife in their most intimate moments. Dr. Thornfield leaned forward with apparent professional interest, though Poirot detected the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested more than academic curiosity. The psychological profile of such a manipulator would indeed be fascinating to study, Monsieur Poirot. The combination of intimate knowledge, technical skill, and emotional manipulation suggests someone with considerable expertise in human psychology. Precisely, Doctor. Someone who understood that the most effective prison is not constructed of bars and walls, but of false hope and manufactured memory. Someone who recognized that a grieving widow's vulnerability could be transformed into a weapon against her own happiness. The little Belgian detective moved to examine the metal case, handling it with the reverence due crucial evidence. This remarkable container was discovered hidden beneath the fountain in the conservatory, in the place where we first spoke of forever, as the forged message suggested. Within it, we found draft copies of the very telegrams that have so conveniently appeared to confirm David Ashworth's survival and subsequent escape from Swiss custody. He opened the case with theatrical precision, revealing the damning contents to the assembled company. Typing exercises, mes amis. Practice runs for the phrases Bundespolizei, Transit Zurich-Bern, and the signature of the fictional Inspector Müller. Someone has been very busy creating an elaborate fiction, complete with official documentation and international correspondence. Lady Pemberton's composure wavered slightly as the implications became clear. But who could have known about the hiding place? Who would have had access to such intimate details of Vivienne's marriage? Someone who was present during the darkest period of her grief, madame. Someone who offered comfort and professional guidance during those vulnerable months when sorrow had stripped away all defenses. Poirot's gaze moved methodically around the circle, pausing briefly on each face before continuing. Someone who used the sacred trust of their professional relationship to gather the very ammunition that would later be used to imprison her in perpetual widowhood. The atmosphere in the room had grown thick with tension, each person acutely aware that they were part of a tightening circle of suspicion. Charles Whitfield looked genuinely bewildered, while Captain Pemberton maintained his military bearing despite obvious discomfort. Miss Fairfax watched everything with the keen attention of a professional observer, her sharp eyes missing no detail of the unfolding drama. The motive, when we examine it closely, is elegantly simple, Poirot continued, his voice taking on the relentless rhythm of inexorable logic. The trust fund established in Madame Ashworth's name contained a reversion clause. Should she remarry, the substantial sum would return to the Pemberton estate. Someone with influence over the management of these funds had every reason to ensure that such a remarriage never occurred. Dr. Thornfield's professional composure remained intact, though Poirot noted the almost imperceptible tightening of his hands on his medical bag. Financial motives are certainly compelling, but surely the psychological complexity of such a scheme suggests deeper motivations. Perhaps the perpetrator genuinely believed they were protecting Mrs. Ashworth from making poor decisions in her vulnerable state. An interesting observation, Doctor. Indeed, the most dangerous criminals are often those who convince themselves that their cruelty is actually kindness, that their manipulation serves the victim's best interests. Poirot's eyes glittered with cold fire. Such people are capable of extraordinary self-deception, justifying even murder as a form of protection. The room fell silent except for the gentle crackling of the fire and the measured ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Ashworth sat motionless, her face cycling through expressions of hope, confusion, and dawning horror as the implications of Poirot's words settled in her mind. Tomorrow morning, Poirot announced with quiet finality, we shall conclude this investigation with a demonstration that will remove all doubt about the identity of our architect of deception. I will ask each of you to perform a simple writing exercise, copying certain phrases from the forged telegrams under my direct observation. It is not the letter forms I will study, but the habits, the hesitations, the unconscious patterns that reveal the true author. He moved once more to the mantelpiece, this time leaving a small clock slightly askew, a deliberate imperfection in the ordered world someone had worked so hard to control. Until then, I must ask that everyone remain exactly where they are. No letters are to be written, no telephone calls made, no attempts at communication with the outside world. We have reached the moment of truth, and truth, as we know, has a way of asserting itself despite all attempts at concealment. Inspector Japp rose from his position by the door, his professional instincts alert to the possibility of desperate action from a cornered criminal. Any attempt to leave Greystone Hall will be prevented, and anyone who tries will find themselves under immediate arrest. As the company began to disperse to their rooms, each person acutely aware that the morning would bring final revelation, Poirot remained behind in the drawing room. He stood before the fireplace, studying the deliberately displaced clock with the satisfaction of a master craftsman who had successfully set his most delicate trap. The lady who forgot she was married was about to discover that her greatest enemy had been hiding not in the shadows of her past, but in the very heart of her present life, wearing the mask of professional concern and trusted friendship. Tomorrow would bring the final act of this 7-year tragedy, but tonight belonged to the subtle art of psychological pressure applied with surgical precision to a mind that could no longer bear the weight of its own elaborate deceptions. The game was nearly over, and Hercule Poirot had never been more certain that justice would prevail over even the most cunningly constructed web of lies. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Greystone Hall's drawing room seemed to illuminate not just the familiar furnishings, but the very air of expectation that had settled over the assembled company. Hercule Poirot stood before the mantelpiece with characteristic precision, his dark suit immaculate, his famous mustaches waxed to geometric perfection. Behind him, the fire whispered with reassuring warmth, but the atmosphere carried the electric tension that precedes the final act of a long and complex drama. Inspector Japp had positioned himself near the door, his weathered face showing the alert attention of a professional who sensed that years of patient investigation were about to culminate in justice. The assembled household took their designated seats with the careful deliberation of actors approaching their final scene, each person acutely aware that the morning would bring revelation and, for one among them, the end of an elaborate masquerade. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth sat nearest the fire, her face pale but determined, the infamous diary resting in her lap, like evidence of her own torment. Charles Whitfield occupied the chair beside her, his earlier ordeal as a suspect having left him visibly shaken but hopeful for vindication. Lady Pemberton maintained her aristocratic composure, though the slight tremor in her hands betrayed the strain of having her carefully ordered world subjected to such scrutiny. Miss Dorothy Fairfax, despite the bandage still visible beneath her carefully arranged hair, had insisted on being present. Her sharp eyes swept the assembled company with the keen attention of one who had suffered for seeking truth. Captain Geoffrey Pemberton sat with military bearing, his tactical awareness evident in the way his gaze moved between Poirot and the other suspects. Dr. Marcus Thornfield entered last, his medical bag in hand, explaining with professional courtesy that he wished to monitor Mrs. Ashworth's condition during what promised to be an emotionally challenging morning. He selected his usual chair with characteristic precision, his composed demeanor intact despite the subtle signs of strain that Poirot's trained eye detected around his mouth and eyes. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded attention in drawing rooms across Europe. "We gather this morning to conclude an investigation that has revealed not merely a murder, but something far more insidious, a masterpiece of psychological cruelty that has consumed 7 years in its construction and 4 days in its exposure." He moved to the center of the room, pausing to make a minute adjustment to a small ornamental clock on the side table. The timepiece had been deliberately left askew the previous evening, and Poirot noted with satisfaction that it now sat in perfect alignment. Someone had been unable to resist the compulsion to restore order, even under the most intense scrutiny. What we have witnessed at Greystone Hall is not a simple crime of passion, but a systematic campaign of psychological warfare waged against a vulnerable woman using her own love and grief as weapons. The murder of Monsieur James Hartwell, while tragic, represents merely the final, desperate act in a much larger and more cruel design. He gestured toward the evidence arranged with mathematical precision on the mahogany table. The burned telegram fragments, the forged diary, the trust fund documentation, and most significantly, a small vial of clear liquid that gleamed in the morning light. Each piece of this puzzle tells us something about the mind that created it. We are dealing with someone who possesses not only considerable intelligence, but an obsessive need for control that borders on the pathological. Mrs. Ashworth's grip tightened on the diary. "Mr. Poirot, you promised us the truth. Surely someone among us knows whether David is truly alive or dead." "He is dead, madame," Poirot replied with gentle finality. "Your husband died in that climbing accident 7 years ago, exactly as you were first told. All the rest, the diary, the telegrams, the elaborate fiction of his survival, was manufactured to serve one purpose: to keep you trapped in perpetual widowhood for the financial benefit of another." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Mrs. Ashworth's sharp intake of breath as the implications became clear. "Consider the diary that has caused you such anguish," Poirot continued, accepting the leather-bound volume from her trembling hands. It is not merely a forgery, it is a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Every entry speaks to your deepest hopes and fears, echoing conversations and memories that were shared in the most private moments of your marriage. The phrase, "the place where we first spoke of forever." This intimate detail was known only to you and your late husband. He paused, his keen eyes sweeping the assembled faces. Or so you believed. But someone else possessed this knowledge, someone who had gained access to your most guarded secrets during the vulnerable period following your husband's death. Someone who offered comfort and professional guidance while secretly cataloging every detail that might later be used as ammunition. Dr. Thornfield leaned forward with apparent professional interest, though Poirot detected the slight tightening around his eyes. The psychological manipulation required would indeed be extraordinary, Monsieur Poirot. The perpetrator would need not only technical skills, but deep insight into human vulnerability. Precisely, Doctor. And such insight is not acquired casually. It comes from years of professional training in the study of human psychology, combined with a position of sacred trust that allows access to a patient's most private thoughts. Poirot's gaze fixed on Thornfield with laser intensity. It comes from someone who was present during the darkest period of grief, who heard every intimate confession, every cherished memory, every vulnerable moment of despair. The atmosphere in the room had grown thick with tension as the implications of Poirot's words settled over the company. Mrs. Ashworth stared at her former physician with dawning horror, finally beginning to understand the scope of his betrayal. The motive, when we examine it closely, is elegantly simple, Poirot continued, moving to the evidence table. The trust fund established in Madame Ashworth's name contained a crucial reversion clause. Should she remarry, the substantial sum would return to the Pemberton estate. But who stood to benefit most directly from managing such funds? Who collected fees for overseeing investments while ensuring the principal remained intact through the simple expedient of preventing remarriage? He lifted the trust fund documentation, his voice taking on the relentless rhythm of inexorable logic. Dr. Thornfield served not only as Mrs. Ashworth's physician, but as advisor to Lady Pemberton on financial matters. The longer Mrs. Ashworth remained a widow, the longer those lucrative management fees continued. When she began to recover from her grief, when Charles Whitfield appeared as a potential husband, the doctor escalated his campaign of psychological manipulation. Lady Pemberton's face had gone pale as the financial implications became clear. Dr. Thornfield, surely you cannot have... I acted in everyone's best interests, Thornfield interrupted, his professional composure finally showing cracks. Mrs. Ashworth was vulnerable, easily manipulated by fortune hunters. The trust provided security, stability. My guidance protected her from making dangerous emotional decisions. Your guidance, Poirot replied with cold fury, transformed her grief into a prison and her love into chains. He moved closer to Thornfield, his penetrating gaze never wavering. You used the sacred trust of the physician-patient relationship to extract her most intimate memories, then weaponized those confidences against her future happiness. Poirot lifted the small vial from the evidence table. Chloral hydrate, Doctor. A sedative that requires precise medical knowledge to administer safely. The same substance found in Miss Fairfax's system after her attack in the writing room. She surprised you during your nocturnal activities, burning evidence, retrieving the diary from Lady Pemberton's safe, and you silenced her with professional efficiency. Miss Fairfax touched the bandage on her head, her voice steady despite the memory of her ordeal. The antiseptic smell. I detected it when I was struck. Medical supplies mixed with tobacco smoke. At the time, I thought it merely an odd combination. Not odd at all, mademoiselle, but revealing. Dr. Thornfield's pipe tobacco, mixed with the antiseptic he carries in his medical supplies, created a distinctive scent, the same combination found in the ash discovered near Monsieur Hartwell's body in the conservatory. Poirot moved to stand directly before Thornfield, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. When James Hartwell developed a conscience about his role in the deception, When he threatened to expose the truth about the fabricated death certificate and the years of financial manipulation, you lured him to the conservatory. You struck him down with the crystal paperweight, a weapon of opportunity chosen in a moment of desperate calculation. Hartwell was weak, Thornfield said quietly, his mask of professional concern finally slipping entirely. He began making noises about confessing, about exposing arrangements that had worked perfectly well for 7 years. He would have destroyed everything I had worked to build. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence, confirming what Poirot's investigation had established through careful deduction. Mrs. Ashworth stared at her former physician with a mixture of horror and revulsion, finally understanding the full extent of his betrayal. The diary itself reveals your methodology, Poirot continued relentlessly. You had access to David Ashworth's original letters, preserved by Lady Pemberton at Mrs. Ashworth's request. You studied his handwriting, his manner of expression, his intimate knowledge of private moments. But most, cruelly, you used the therapeutic confidences Mrs. Ashworth had shared during her darkest hours. Her memories of their wedding night, their private jokes, their most sacred moments together. He opened the diary to a specific page, his voice carrying the weight of moral judgment. Here you wrote, "The place where we first spoke of forever holds the key to our reunion." This phrase could only have come from Mrs. Ashworth's own lips during therapy, when grief had stripped away all defenses, and she shared her most precious memories with someone she trusted completely. Mrs. Ashworth's voice was barely a whisper. You used everything I told you in confidence, every memory I shared while grieving. Not merely used, madame. Weaponized. Dr. Thornfield understood that the most effective prison is not built of stone and iron, but of false hope and manufactured memory. He kept you trapped in perpetual widowhood by convincing you that your love story might yet have a happy ending, that your husband might still live, that remarriage would be a betrayal rather than a natural progression of healing. Inspector Japp had been taking careful notes throughout Poirot's exposition, and now he looked up with grim satisfaction. The evidence is overwhelming, Doctor. The chloral hydrate, the antiseptic tobacco mixture, your access to the original letters, your position as trustee, and most damning of all, your own compulsive need for order that led you to straighten that clock despite knowing you were under suspicion. Poirot nodded toward the mantelpiece where the small timepiece sat in perfect alignment. Last evening, I deliberately left that clock askew, knowing that someone with your psychological profile would find such imperfection genuinely unbearable. You could not resist correcting it, even knowing you were under the most intense scrutiny. Your need for control, for perfect order, ultimately betrayed you. Dr. Thornfield sat motionless in his chair, his earlier composure completely evaporated. The man who had spent years manipulating the psychology of others now found himself exposed and defenseless, his elaborate web of deception unraveled, thread by thread. 7 years, Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice trembling with emotion. 7 years of my life stolen because you couldn't bear to lose control over me. How many nights did I lie awake wondering if David might still be alive? How many times did I refuse happiness because I thought I might be betraying a husband who was actually dead? I told myself I was protecting you, Thornfield replied, his voice barely audible. You were so vulnerable after David's death, so easily hurt. I convinced myself that keeping you single was for your own good, that managing your affairs was a service rather than exploitation. And the money? Poirot inquired with deadly quiet. The money was convenient. But it wasn't the primary motivation. It was the control, the knowledge that I could shape another person's entire existence through careful manipulation of their psychological state. It became an obsession, a demonstration of professional expertise that grew beyond all reasonable bounds. Inspector Japp rose from his chair, his professional duties clear. Dr. Marcus Thornfield, I arrest you for the murder of James Hartwell, for the assault on Miss Dorothy Fairfax, and for conspiracy to defraud Mrs. Vivian Ashworth. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Thornfield looked once more at Mrs. Ashworth with an expression that might have been regret or merely disappointment at the failure of his elaborate scheme. "I genuinely believed I was acting in your best interests, Vivienne. You were so fragile, so easily manipulated. I thought I was protecting you from making another mistake." "You were protecting your own interests," she replied with quiet dignity that would have made her late husband proud. "You stole 7 years of my life and called it kindness. You used my love for David as a weapon against my future happiness. That's not protection, that's cruelty of the most refined and calculated sort." As Dr. Thornfield was led away, the remaining members of the household sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full implications of what they had witnessed. The lady who forgot she was married had finally remembered the truth. Not about her husband's fictional survival, but about the systematic way her grief had been exploited by someone she had trusted with her most vulnerable moments. Charles Whitfield moved to sit beside Mrs. Ashworth, offering silent comfort as she processed the magnitude of the betrayal. Lady Pemberton sat rigid with aristocratic fury at having her household used as the stage for such elaborate deception. Captain Pemberton and Miss Fairfax exchanged glances of mutual respect, having both contributed crucial observations to the investigation's success. Hercule Poirot stood before the fireplace, straightening his waistcoat with characteristic precision. The case was solved, justice would be served, but the human cost of such elaborate psychological manipulation would take far longer to heal than the physical wounds inflicted. "Order has been restored," Poirot observed quietly, "but not without cost. The human heart, when subjected to such systematic cruelty, requires time and patience to heal. Madame Ashworth, you have been freed from a prison of false memories and manufactured hope. The path forward will not be easy, but it will be honest." Mrs. Ashworth looked up at the little Belgian detective with gratitude and exhaustion in equal measure. "Thank you, Mr. Poirot. For the first time in 7 years, I know exactly where I stand, not in the shadow of false hope, but in the light of truth, however painful it might be." As the household began to disperse, each person carrying the weight of revelation in their own way, Poirot remained in the drawing room for a final moment of contemplation. He made one last adjustment to the ornamental clock, ensuring perfect alignment, then smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a master craftsman who had successfully dismantled a mechanism designed to cause infinite harm. The lady who forgot she was married would remember everything now. The love she had lost, the grief she had endured, and most importantly, the strength she possessed to build a future free from the manipulations of those who would use trust as a weapon. In the end, truth had proven more powerful than even the most elaborate deception, and justice had prevailed over the darkest impulses of the human heart. The little gray cells had triumphed once again, but the victory felt profound rather than hollow. For in exposing Dr. Thornfield's cruel prescription of false hope, Poirot had administered the only medicine that could truly heal, the bitter but liberating draught of unvarnished truth. The days that followed Dr. Thornfield's arrest settled over Greystone Hall with the peculiar quiet that descends after a storm has passed, leaving in its wake both devastation and the promise of clearer skies. The household moved with the careful deliberation of those who had witnessed the systematic dismantling of a 7-year deception, each person processing in their own way the magnitude of betrayal that had been perpetrated under the guise of medical care and trusted friendship. Hercule Poirot remained at Greystone Hall for 3 additional days, not from any investigative necessity, but from his recognition that the human aftermath of such elaborate psychological manipulation required as much attention as the criminal proceedings that would inevitably follow. He observed with characteristic precision the various stages of shock, anger, and gradual acceptance that marked each person's journey toward understanding what they had endured. The legal machinery of justice moved with impressive efficiency once the full scope of Dr. Thornfield's deception became clear. Inspector Japp reported that the former physician, when confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, had abandoned his initial protestations of innocence and made a complete confession. The chloral hydrate found in his medical bag, the forged telegrams discovered in the metal case beneath the conservatory fountain, and the undeniable pattern of psychological manipulation spanning 7 years had created an insurmountable case against him. He spoke for nearly 4 hours. Japp informed Poirot as they reviewed the confession in Lady Pemberton's study. Detailed every aspect of his scheme, from the initial decision to exploit Mrs. Ashworth's grief to the murder of Hartwell when the solicitor threatened to expose everything. What struck me most was his continued insistence that he had acted in everyone's best interests. Even with the handcuffs on, he maintained that he was protecting Mrs. Ashworth from making emotional decisions that would have harmed her. Poirot nodded with grim satisfaction. The mind that can justify such cruelty as kindness is perhaps the most dangerous of all, Inspector. Dr. Thornfield genuinely believed that his manipulation was a form of therapy, that keeping Mrs. Ashworth trapped in perpetual widowhood was preferable to allowing her the natural process of grief and recovery. The arrival of official correspondence from the Swiss Federal Police provided the final confirmation that David Ashworth had indeed perished in the climbing accident 7 years earlier. The certified documents, bearing proper watermarks and official seals that even Poirot's exacting standards could not fault, contained the complete record of the rescue attempt, the recovery of personal effects, and the consular arrangements that had been made at the time. James Hartwell, it emerged, had not been involved in falsifying the original death certificate. His crime lay in his later complicity with Dr. Thornfield's psychological manipulation and his management of the trust fund arrangements that had provided the financial motive for the entire scheme. Mrs. Vivian Ashworth received this confirmation with a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. The false hope that had sustained and tormented her for so long was finally extinguished, but in its place came the authentic sorrow of a widow who could at last mourn her husband properly, without the distraction of manufactured mystery or the burden of impossible expectations. "I feel as though I'm losing David all over again," she confided to Poirot during one of their quiet conversations in the conservatory. The scene of so much deception now transformed into a place of honest reflection. But this time, the loss is real rather than artificial. This time I can grieve without wondering if my tears are premature, without hoping that tomorrow might bring word of his miraculous survival. The symbolic destruction of the forged diary took place on the 3rd evening, with all members of the household serving as witnesses to the cremation of Dr. Thornfield's masterwork of manipulation. Mrs. Ashworth herself fed the pages into the drawing-room fireplace, watching as each carefully crafted lie dissolved into ash and smoke. The intimate details of her marriage that had been so cruelly weaponized against her future happiness were finally released from their prison of false hope. "I love David Ashworth completely," she said as the last fragments curled and blackened in the flames. "I will always love the memory of the man he truly was. Brave, reckless, devoted, and gone. I forgive myself for allowing that love to be used as a weapon against my own healing, and I release both of us from the artificial bonds that Dr. Thornfield created to serve his own purposes." Charles Whitfield, who had endured his own ordeal as a suspect in the investigation, proved himself to be a man of genuine character in the aftermath of these revelations. Rather than pressing for immediate resolution of their engagement, he offered Mrs. Ashworth the time and space necessary to rediscover her authentic self, free from the psychological constraints that had shaped her behavior for 7 years. "We have time, Vivian," he assured her with gentle wisdom. "Time to learn who we are together when neither of us is defined by artificial circumstances or manufactured obligations. Whatever develops between us must be built on the foundation of truth rather than the ruins of elaborate deception." Lady Pemberton faced the scandal with characteristic aristocratic resolve, though the revelation that her trusted physician and solicitor had conspired to exploit a guest under her own roof left her visibly shaken. She immediately engaged new legal counsel to review all financial arrangements connected to the Ashworth Trust, ensuring that the reversion clause that had provided Dr. Thornfield's motive was permanently eliminated. The substantial sum involved would now belong to Mrs. Ashworth unconditionally, regardless of her future marital status. I pride myself on being an excellent judge of character, Lady Pemberton admitted to Poirot with rare vulnerability. To discover that I welcomed such predators into my home, that I trusted them with the welfare of someone under my protection, is perhaps the most humbling experience of my life. I shall be far more cautious in my choice of professional advisors in the future. Miss Dorothy Fairfax, despite the lingering effects of her assault, found quiet satisfaction in her role in exposing Dr. Thornfield's deception. Her sharp observations and unwavering commitment to truth had proven instrumental in Poirot's investigation, and she bore her injuries as badges of honor earned in service of justice. Captain Geoffrey Pemberton, cleared of all suspicion but chastened by his experience as a potential suspect, used the crisis as motivation to address his financial difficulties through legitimate means, rather than the shortcuts that had made him vulnerable to manipulation. His military bearing, tested by civilian challenges, emerged strengthened by the ordeal. The public reaction to Dr. Thornfield's crimes was one of profound shock and revulsion. The violation of the sacred trust between physician and patient, combined with the elaborate nature of his psychological manipulation, captured the imagination of newspaper readers across the country. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked professional authority and the vulnerability of those who seek help during their darkest hours. At his trial, Dr. Thornfield would receive a sentence of 20 years for the murder of James Hartwell, with additional terms for assault, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, in passing sentence, spoke with unusual emotion about the particular cruelty of using medical knowledge and psychological expertise to exploit rather than heal human suffering. On his final morning at Greystone Hall, Hercule Poirot found himself once again in the conservatory, making minute adjustments to the arrangement of potted plants that had been disturbed during the investigation. The exotic blooms continued their eternal dance with light and shadow, indifferent to the human drama that had played out among them, but somehow more beautiful for having witnessed the triumph of truth over elaborate deception. Mrs. Ashworth joined him there, no longer the haunted woman who had discovered a forged diary beside a murdered man, but someone beginning the long journey toward authentic healing and self-discovery. "You have given me back my life, Mr. Poirot," she said with quiet gratitude. "Not the life I imagined I wanted with its impossible hope of reunion, but the life I actually possess, with its genuine grief, its real possibilities, and its honest choices." "Madame," Poirot replied with characteristic precision, "I have merely restored order where chaos had been deliberately introduced. The life you speak of was always yours. Dr. Thornfield's crime was in convincing you that it belonged to someone else, that your choices were not your own to make. Truth, however painful, is always preferable to the most beautiful lie." As his taxi carried him back toward London, Hercule Poirot reflected on the particular satisfaction that came from solving a case where justice served not merely legal requirements, but genuine human need. The lady who forgot she was married had finally remembered everything that mattered. Not the false promise of resurrection that had imprisoned her for 7 years, but the authentic experience of love, loss, and the possibility of healing that comes only through honest confrontation with reality. In his extensive career, Poirot had encountered many forms of criminal ingenuity, but few had struck him as more fundamentally evil than Dr. Thornfield's systematic exploitation of grief and trust. The physician had used his professional knowledge not to heal, but to inflict a particularly refined form of torture, transforming love itself into an instrument of imprisonment. Yet the case had also demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the human spirit when freed from artificial constraints. Mrs. Ashworth's journey toward recovery would be long and complex, but it would be honest in a way that the previous 7 years had not been. Charles Whitfield's patient devotion suggested that love built on truth might prove more durable than relationships founded on desperate circumstances or manufactured crises. The little gray cells had triumphed once again, but more importantly, order had been restored to a world where chaos had been deliberately cultivated for the basest of motives. As the familiar streets of London came into view, Poirot allowed himself the quiet satisfaction of a master craftsman who had successfully dismantled a mechanism designed to cause infinite harm and replaced it with the possibility of genuine peace. Truth, as always, had proven more powerful than even the most sophisticated deception, and justice had prevailed over the darkest impulses of the human heart. In the end, that was all any detective, however celebrated his methods or renowned his little gray cells, could hope to achieve in a world where the line between healing and harm often depended on the intentions of those entrusted with the most vulnerable aspects of human nature. The case was closed, but its lessons would linger long after Dr. Thornfield had begun serving his sentence, and Mrs. Ashworth had begun building a life free from the shadows of manufactured ghosts. For in exposing the physician's cruel prescription of false hope, Hercule Poirot had administered the only medicine that could truly heal, the bitter but liberating draught of unvarnished truth. The business of justice, though inexorable, seldom moves with the dramatic flourish of its detective prologue. In the grey November days that followed Miss Beatrice Foyle's arrest, life at Wren House arranged itself into a new, chastened order. The drawing room, once the stage for elegant dinner parties, now bore the invisible weight of betrayal and revelation, though the afternoon light still filtered through its tall windows with the same indifferent beauty. Inspector Japp, to his considerable credit, took the reversal of his initial conclusions with something approaching grace. "You nabbed this one cleanly, Poirot," he admitted when we called at the yard to conclude the formal proceedings. "I'll own I don't fancy being led by a handkerchief again." His gruff acknowledgment carried the wisdom of experience. Even the most seasoned investigators could be deceived by sufficiently sophisticated deception. Young Hugh Lessing's release came swiftly once Poirot's methodical documentation reached the proper authorities. I was present when he returned to Wren House, moving awkwardly as if the very floor might give way beneath him. His aunt rose to embrace him with an abandon that temporarily swept aside the decorums of Belgrave Square, and in that moment, something human and healing entered the wounded household. The network unraveled. The investigation's expansion revealed the staggering scope of Miss Foyle's criminal enterprise. Under interrogation, her network of accomplices proved far less resolute than their mastermind. The craftsman in Clerkenwell led authorities to specialists in Birmingham, Sheffield, and Edinburgh, artisans capable of replicating everything from medieval manuscripts to Chippendale furniture with devastating accuracy. Financial records seized from her various accounts revealed transactions totaling more than £50,000, a fortune built upon the systematic plunder of England's cultural treasures. Her method had remained consistent across nearly a decade of operations. Secure a position of trust, study valuable pieces with professional thoroughness, arrange for expert reproductions, then execute substitutions during routine maintenance. The original pieces vanished into discrete continental networks, their provenance obscured, their theft undetected for years. Most disturbing was Miss Foyle's complete absence of remorse. During her interviews with Scotland Yard's specialists, she maintained the cold conviction that her crimes represented cultural redistribution rather than theft. They possessed beauty they could neither understand nor appreciate, she told investigators with chilling certainty. I ensured these treasures found their way to collectors who could properly value their significance. Personal accountings. Sir Ambrose faced perhaps the most complex aftermath of all the victims. His beloved collection, the passion of his lifetime, had been systematically compromised by someone he had trusted completely. The authentication of each piece would require extensive professional examination, but the psychological impact would prove far more enduring than any financial losses. I find myself questioning everything, Monsieur Poirot. He confessed during our final visit to his violated library. Each piece I examine, I wonder, is this genuine, or am I admiring another of her masterful deceptions? Poirot's response carried the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the destruction of trust many times before. Monsieur, the value of beauty lies not in its monetary worth or even its authenticity, but in the understanding it brings to those who appreciate it. Do not allow her crimes to rob you of your capacity for appreciation. That would be to grant her a victory she does not deserve. Mrs. Lydia Wren, shaken by the revelation that someone she had trusted completely had systematically betrayed that trust, channeled her distress into renewed charitable efforts. The Children's Festival in Bloomsbury, deprived of Darnley's promised support by his death, received an unexpected benefactor when she decided to fund the expansion herself. Young Hugh, meanwhile, accepted his uncle's offer of modest employment, cataloguing the collection. Work that was, as he observed, humiliating in its humility. "It is honest," Poirot replied gently. "One does not cure a bent sapling by gilding it, but by staking it until it can stand." The final reckoning. At the Old Bailey, the case proceeded with the inexorable certainty that Poirot's methodical investigation had made inevitable. Evidence of the forgery network, the financial trail, the specialized conservation wax, and the microscopic traces on the place card wove together into a net that even Miss Foyle's subtle mind could not escape. Her counsel argued her gifts and grievances. The jury heard her intelligence with respect and her contempt with distaste. The verdict, when it came, satisfied the law while leaving unsatisfied her nebulous claims on the sympathy of the wronged. A final letter arrived for Poirot after the trial, written in Miss Foyle's precise hand. It contained no apology, only a grudging acknowledgement. "You have, I think, a true appreciation of exactitude. It is some consolation to have been mastered by a practitioner rather than a bungler." Even in defeat, she arranged the papers with characteristic precision, providing information that assisted in recovering additional stolen pieces. Philosophical conclusions. On the evening that truly closed the affair, Mrs. Wren hosted a modest gathering, not of the great and good, but of the small and steadfast. There was soup, then beef, then apple tart. Everyone ate. After the long austerity of suspicion, the simple, honest meal seemed a kind of absolution. As we took our leave, Mrs. Wren pressed Poirot's hand. "You have returned us to ourselves," she said, tears brightening her eyes. "That is the kindest restoration of all." In our cab returning to Whitehaven Mansions, I ventured a final reflection. There was something terrible in her, Poirot, and something admirable. "The admirable was the discipline," he replied thoughtfully. "The terrible was the purpose to which she put it. When order serves pride, it becomes tyranny. When it serves truth, it is justice." He settled against the cushions with satisfaction. "And you observe, Hastings, that at last the dinner was properly eaten." "How do you mean?" "At Wren House, on that first evening, one guest did not eat because a certain appetite, vanity, devoured him first. Tonight, all ate because humbler appetites, gratitude, companionship, had their proper place. It is my philosophy that when the stomach and the conscience agree, the world is well arranged." As London's lamps pricked through the rising mist, I felt again that mingled comfort and awe that Poirot's presence always evoked. The case had ended not with triumphal horns, but with the restoration of order in a few square rooms and a handful of hearts. For Hercule Poirot, it was everything. Thus concludes The Affair at the Dinner Guest Who Never Ate. Justice has been served, the innocent vindicated, and order restored, though not without lasting scars. The invisible woman has been seen at last, but the price of that visibility echoes through the corridors of Wren House long after the great detective has departed to restore order to other disordered worlds. It was on a crisp morning in late February that the final piece of the Greystone Hall puzzle arrived at Hercule Poirot's London flat, delivered not by human messenger, but by the inexorable forces of nature itself. The little Belgian detective sat at his breakfast table, his morning routine proceeding with characteristic precision, when the post brought a thick envelope bearing the official seal of the Swiss Federal Police and the postmark of Zermatt. Captain Hastings, who had arrived for their weekly breakfast meeting, watched with interest as Poirot examined the foreign correspondence with his customary attention to detail. The envelope's weight and official appearance suggested something of considerable importance, though neither man could have anticipated the profound significance of its contents. "From Switzerland, Poirot?" Hastings inquired, settling into his chair with the comfortable familiarity of long friendship. "Indeed, mon ami, and if I am not mistaken, this correspondence relates to our recent investigation at Greystone Hall." Poirot slit the envelope with surgical precision, revealing not only an official letter, but a smaller, weather-stained packet wrapped in protective oilcloth. The accompanying letter, written in formal German and English, explained that the spring thaw had revealed a previously inaccessible crevice high on the Matterhorn's northern face. Within this natural tomb, Swiss rescue authorities had discovered the preserved remains of climbing equipment and personal effects belonging to David Ashworth, along with a leather pocketbook containing what appeared to be his final written words. Poirot unwrapped the oilcloth with reverent care, revealing a small, battered notebook stained by 7 years of ice and weather. Between its fused pages lay a single sheet of paper, brittle as autumn leaves but still legible. The handwriting, though cramped by cold and urgency, was unmistakably authentic, the genuine script of a man facing his final moments with courage and love. The message was brief but profound in its simplicity. V. My darling, the weather has turned against me, and I fear I have misjudged the mountain's mood. If these words are ever found, know that my last thoughts were of you. Do not let grief become your prison. Live fully, love again if your heart permits it, and remember that the greatest gift you can give to my memory is your own happiness. The place where we first spoke of forever was not a location, but a moment, and that moment lives in you always. All my love, D. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle ticking of Poirot's mantel clock and the distant sounds of London awakening to another day. Hastings, reading over his friend's shoulder, felt the weight of authentic emotion in those few, carefully chosen words, a stark contrast to the elaborate fabrications that Dr. Thornfield had constructed with such malicious skill. "Good Lord, Poirot," Hastings whispered. "The difference is unmistakable, isn't it? This is the voice of a man who truly loved his wife, not the manipulative fiction we encountered in that forged diary. Précisément, mon ami, observe how genuine love expresses itself, not in elaborate promises or mysterious conspiracies, but in simple, honest concern for the beloved's future happiness." David Ashworth's final words were not designed to bind his wife to perpetual mourning, but to free her from the very prison that Dr. Thornfield would later construct around her grief. That afternoon brought Mrs. Vivian Ashworth to Poirot's flat, summoned by telegram to receive this final gift from the mountain that had claimed her husband. She entered with the quiet dignity that had marked her recovery from Dr. Thornfield's psychological manipulation, no longer the haunted woman who had discovered a forged diary beside a murdered solicitor, but someone who had reclaimed her right to shape her own destiny. Poirot presented the authentic letter with characteristic ceremony, watching as she read her husband's final words with tears that spoke not of renewed anguish, but of profound relief. Here, at last, was the genuine voice she had loved. Not the elaborate fiction that had tormented her for 7 years, but the simple, honest expression of a man who had faced death, with thoughts only of her future happiness. "He was always practical," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Even at the end, his concern was not for himself, but for me. This is David as he truly was. Not the mysterious figure lurking in shadows that Dr. Thornfield created, but a man who loved me enough to want me to be free. She folded the letter carefully, holding it as one might hold a sacred relic. I understand now why the forged diary felt so wrong, even when part of me desperately wanted to believe it. The voice was incorrect, too elaborate, too focused on conspiracy and hidden meetings. David would never have remained hidden while I suffered. If he had survived, he would have come to me directly, openly, without games or deception. Poirot nodded with deep satisfaction. The authentic heart, madame, recognizes authenticity, even when the conscious mind is clouded by hope and desperation. Your instinctive fear of the diary's contents was your soul's recognition that someone was using your love as a weapon against your peace. The discovery of David's genuine final message had a profound effect on Mrs. Ashworth's continued healing. She spoke of plans to visit Switzerland, not to chase phantom hopes of reunion, but to honor her husband's memory at the place where he had faced his final challenge with courage and love. She mentioned, too, her growing friendship with Charles Whitfield, a relationship now built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than the desperate need for solace that had initially brought them together. "We are taking our time," she explained with quiet wisdom. "Both of us understand that any future we might build together must be founded on who we truly are, not on who we became under the influence of artificial circumstances. Dr. Thornfield's manipulations affected us both, and we must heal separately before we can consider healing together." As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Ashworth turned to Poirot with profound gratitude. "You have given me back not only my life, but my faith in the authenticity of human emotion. For 7 years, I doubted my own feelings, wondered if my grief was genuine or manufactured, questioned whether my memories of David were real or imagined. This letter restores my confidence in the truth of what we shared." After her departure, Poirot remained in his study, contemplating the profound lessons embedded in this final revelation. The contrast between David Ashworth's authentic final words and Dr. Thornfield's elaborate forgeries provided a perfect illustration of the difference between genuine human emotion and calculated manipulation. "You see, Hastings," he observed to his friend, "how truth and falsehood reveal themselves through their very nature. David's authentic message seeks to liberate, while Thornfield's forgeries sought to imprison. Genuine love desires the beloved's happiness above all else, while possessive control masquerades as protection while actually serving the manipulator's interests." Hastings nodded thoughtfully. "It's remarkable how the Mountain preserved that letter for 7 years, only to release it at precisely the moment when Mrs. Ashworth needed final confirmation of her husband's authentic voice. Nature, mon ami, has its own sense of justice. The glacier that claimed David Ashworth also preserved his final gift to his wife, the gift of freedom expressed in his own hand and authenticated by 7 years of ice and stone." Poirot made a minute adjustment to a small ornament on his desk, restoring perfect alignment. Dr. Thornfield spent years constructing elaborate lies, but the Mountain held the simple truth that would ultimately expose every deception. The case had reached its final resolution, not through human investigation, but through the patient testimony of ice and stone. Mrs. Ashworth now possessed not only freedom from Dr. Thornfield's psychological prison, but confirmation that her instinctive recognition of authentic love had been correct all along. The voice in the forged diary had been wrong because it spoke of possession rather than liberation, of control rather than trust, of elaborate deception rather than simple truth. As evening approached, Poirot reflected on the enduring lessons of the Greystone Hall investigation. The case had demonstrated not only the vulnerability of grief to manipulation, but also the remarkable resilience of the human spirit when confronted with authentic truth. Mrs. Ashworth's journey from psychological imprisonment to genuine freedom had been long and painful, but it had ultimately led her to a deeper understanding of both love and loss. "The lady who forgot she was married," Poirot murmured to himself, "has finally remembered everything that truly matters. Not the false promises of resurrection that imprisoned her for 7 years, but the authentic experience of love that seeks the beloved's happiness above all else." He rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the London evening with the satisfaction of a master craftsman who had witnessed the triumph of truth over even the most sophisticated deception. The little grey cells had served their purpose, but in the end, it was the mountain itself that had provided the final, irrefutable testimony to the power of authentic human emotion over calculated manipulation. The case was truly closed now, sealed not by human justice alone, but by the patient testimony of ice and stone. Dr. Thornfield would serve his sentence, knowing that his elaborate web of deception had been exposed not only by detective work, but by the authentic voice of the man whose memory he had so cruelly distorted. And Mrs. Ashworth would continue her journey toward healing, guided not by manufactured hope, but by the genuine love that had been preserved in ice for 7 long years, waiting for the perfect moment to set her free. Truth, as always, had proven more enduring than the most elaborate lie, and love had triumphed over the darkest impulses of the human heart. In the end, that was all any detective, however celebrated his methods or renowned his little grey cells, could hope to achieve in a world where the line between healing and harm often depended on the intentions of those entrusted with the most vulnerable aspects of human nature. Finis.